Good morning, Realty Texas. We have a lot going on in the space. I know that you guys are looking at the news. You're seeing what's being published on CNN, what's being published on Inman, what's being published on ABC News, and we are seeing a lot of mixed messages from the inside group. We're saying nothing's changed, but when you read the news, you hear things like it's an end of a 6% standard commission. We all know that there's no such thing as a standard commission, and of course, it's not the end of anything. One of the biggest professional misconceptions across all professions is how real estate agent commissions work. Even the insiders, even agents who have been doing this for 5 years, don't understand commissions. Even the settlement agreement from the National Association of Realtors from their attorneys had factual inaccuracies in it. Things like where they slip up and say, agent are paid commissions when they're not. It's broker to broker. So, because there's so much confusion around this enigmatic commissions conversation, no one's going to get it right. So, you're going to read the news and it's going to perplex you because you're going to be standing inside and everyone's telling you it's pouring down rain outside, the sky is falling, you walk outside and it is a beautiful day, birds are singing and the sun is shining. And that's what's really going on is just the lack of actual factual information that's being pushed out so people can truly understand what's going on. And so, whenever the news media gets involved in anything, they're always going to write the headlines and they're always going to try to sensationalize something. So, you're going to get a lot of questions from your consumers and from friends and neighbors, just people who are paying attention to the news, which is fewer and fewer people today. With it being an election year and with election and politics being so divisive, the wars going on in the world and everything happening around us, fewer and fewer people are paying attention to the news. Is that a good news? Is that a good thing? Well, possibly for us right now because people are just kind of shying away from this, but we're seeing it hit the headlines. So we do need talking points. We do need to know how to address all of this. First of all, I have put into the chat some very important documents that I'm going to be referencing throughout this next hour, and it's going to take about an hour. I'm going to break down exactly how we found ourselves here, what the original complaints really meant, what the allegations were. Then the next step, when it went to trial, what the verdict was at trial, and then the summary judgment that happened from the trial. After the summary judgment, what the response from N.A.R. was to appeal it, the amount of money that N.A.R. would have to escrow for the appeal, and then just this week, the settlement agreement that has been reached, not yet signed, but reached. And because they've announced that they've made an agreement, that does not mean that this agreement is settled. Not until it actually is signed and it gets in front of the court and it's so ordered. And that hasn't happened yet. And just as some context, in 2020, actually in 2019, the National Association of Realtors had reached a agreement with the Department of Justice regarding these allegations, and they came up with a list of corrections that they were going to make to the MLS to make the allegations go away. The Department of Justice agreed to them, and then they went back on their agreement. And it was one of the few times in our nation's history where the Department of Justice created an agreement. It was written and signed, and they decided to step away from that agreement, and they allowed the lawsuit to continue. One of the things that's going to be, I think, the biggest tell-all is what the jury did at the end of the trial. They deliberated for less than 1 hour for a $1+ billion outcome, which also has never happened before. So in my slides today, I've got some attorneys that we're going to hear from, and then we're also going to hear from Kevin Sears, who is our National Association of Realtors chairman, and I'm going to step you through all of this step by step. But it really comes down to broker compensation, an agreement between brokers. And for the last 100 years, we've had an agreement between brokers. We just decided to formalize it in around 1990 to use the MLS as that agreement. Prior to the MLS, we had the MLS book, which was a compilation of Polaroid photos and a short description of a property with some short property summary facts, bedroom square footage and whatnot, but certainly less than 1/2 a page per property. And at the bottom right-hand corner was a broker offering to pay the cooperating broker's compensation on the buyer side. That got put into the MLS as a digital offer of compensation, and the plaintiffs alleged that the offer of compensation meant that it was a fixed compensation and that the listing agent, the listing seller rather, never had an opportunity to negotiate the buyer side commission. Again, I'm going to take us step by step, but that's where these initial allegations came from. And they are zooming out and they're talking about the entire country in one conversation. But every single state does things a little bit differently. And all of us here in Texas scratching our head saying, well, actually, in our listing agreement, we have a compensation amount. And then on the next page, it says how much of that compensation we're going to provide to the other side. And so it was already addressed in our listing agreement. So the commission rule at issue, known as the cooperating compensation rule or the participation rule, requires listing brokers to offer a blanket unilateral offer of compensation to buyer brokers in order to submit a listing to the MLS. So Article 17 talks about arbitration. Our MLS rules stated that an offer of compensation was required, and that's where this came from. Required. In order for a listing broker to put a listing in the MLS, it had to accompany buyer broker compensation. Some people looked at that rule and said, why? Why does a seller have to pay the buyer broker? And for a long time, that was the rule. And N.A.R modified that rule several years ago to say, okay, it doesn't have to be a substantial number, but it has to be a penny or more. And then an argument broke out regarding penny versus zero. And it became a conversation. What if the seller doesn't want to pay a penny? And a long deliberated conversation that cost the National Association of Realtors hundreds of millions of dollars over this penny broke out and took almost 4 years for us to arrive where we are in a settlement today. And they said, fine, we will remove, and this happened about 6 months ago, the National Association of Realtors said, we will remove the requirement of compensation at all from the MLS. And we will have a text field of what it is. Could be a toaster, could be a cruise, but it's all hinges upon the MLS and the offer of compensation in the MLS. It begins and ends with that conversation only. This has only to do with the MLS, period. So an end of commissions, an end of buyer brokerage, all of that is completely a fallacy. It is simply a deletion of the commission field in the MLS. And now we as a brokerage community have to figure out how we are going to facilitate the communication of the offer of compensation between brokerages. In 2019, the Moehrl versus the National Association of Realtors was the first claim that hit us. The lawsuit was filed against the National Association of Realtors and several major real estate brokerages, including the National Association of Realtors. The plaintiffs alleged and they argued that the N.A.R policies regarding the sharing of commissions between listing and buying agents, it artificially inflated the cost of buying a home in violation of antitrust laws because of this 1 penny requirement. The settlement outcome of this, and it was a pivotal one, it reached a class action status in March of 2023, just last year, signifying a huge challenge for us now because now we're dealing with a class action lawsuit and we had over 100 different brokerages. Then there was copycat lawsuits that came out, and those copycat lawsuits started with the filing of the Sitzer Burnett case. And the Sitzer Burnett case was very similar to the Moehrl case, but it was a copycat. And when I talk about copycat, I'm gonna show you in the, let me open up my slide here. The original case was 33 pages long. Well, I'm not gonna be able to bring that slide. The 2019 Moehrl versus N.A.R. case and the 2019 Sitzer Burnett case are the actual lawsuit itself, which is in the chat, were both exactly 33 pages, and they had the exact header and they had the exact text on every single page. They were just filed in different states. Then they were filed against Texas Association of Realtors. Then they were filed against the Austin Board of Realtors and San Antonio Board of Realtors and Houston Association of Realtors, even Central Texas Regional MLS. So these copycat lawsuits spread across the entire country. But the Sitzer Burnett case, once it was certified as a class action lawsuit, went to trial. And as they were in trial, Anywhere Real Estate immediately agreed to settle for $83 million to pull themselves out of this lawsuit. RE/MAX decided to pay $55 million to get them out of the lawsuit. So now you have the National Association of Realtors and you had Keller Williams and two other large associations sitting holding the bag trying to figure this out now. When it went to trial, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found in favor of the plaintiff, and the jury awarded the plaintiffs $1.78 billion in damages. The National Association flipped. They said that these claims are baseless. It's impossible for this outcome to have been reached, and they asked for a new trial. They asked for it to be completely dismissed. And then they decided that they were going to go ahead and appeal it. Appealing a outcome like that is not something that is easy to do because it means that they have to escrow money, the entire $1.78 billion into an account, and then they can appeal it. And N.A.R. said, we have the money. We're going to appeal this. And they started going down that road to appeal it. But before we actually got to the appeal, they have just in the last week agreed to settle. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to hear from an attorney. And this is, and let me make sure that I share my screen with the audio so you can hear it. On March 26th, I attended, no, on January 26th, I attended a instructor event from the REBAC Institute, the institute that holds the ABR designation. They held a little webinar for us instructors and N.A.R. leadership. And this attorney, Matt, gave a presentation, and it was a very good history lesson of what happened and how we found ourselves here today. This is going to be about a 12-minute video that we're going to watch, but it's going to give you a much better clarity from an attorney of why the original claim was baseless. So let's hear from Matt.
Take everybody all the way back to March 2019. I know that seems like a really long time ago, almost 5 years at this point. In March of 2019, a class action lawsuit or free-for-all against the profession. So I'm going to take everybody all the way back to March 2019. I know that seems like a really long time ago, almost 5 years at this point. In March of 2019, a class action lawsuit was filed in federal court in the Northern District of Illinois. It became known as the Moehrl case. Class action lawsuits are named after the lead plaintiffs. About a month later, there was a copycat lawsuit that was filed in Missouri federal court. That became known as initially the Sitzer and now the Burnett case. Now, in the Moehrl case, that is a little bit of a larger case. That one was filed and it pertained to home sellers in 20 of the largest markets across the country. The the Burnett case was a little bit more narrow in scope. It only applied to home sellers in Missouri. Now, what both of them have in common is that they named N.A.R. as a defendant along with several corporate defendants, including Home Services of America, Keller Williams, RE/MAX, and Anywhere, formerly known as Realty. And the plaintiffs are alleging violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act. At its core, both of these cases involve the plaintiffs arguing that N.A.R.'s Cooperative Compensation Rule, which, just to be clear, is a rule that says that If a listing brokerage is going to list a property for sale in the MLS, they must disclose and be transparent with how much, if anything, they are offering in the amount of cooperative compensation. That's it. That is the rule. We don't say that how much there is. We don't say a maximum or a minimum or anything like that. Only that the amount of cooperative compensation, if anything, must be disclosed. Now, the plaintiffs are arguing that this rule essentially amounts to a conspiracy to fix commissions paid by home sellers to buyer brokers. On October 31st, I'm sorry, I'll backtrack just one second. Despite the fact that the Burnett case was filed second, it actually went to trial first. And that's for a variety of reasons. Primarily because it was a little bit more narrow in geographic scope. It only applied to sellers in Missouri. It was discovery on that moved along a little bit faster. The judge was also more active in moving the case along. So the Burnett case went to trial this past fall, 2023. On October 31st, after an 11-day jury trial, the jury did return a verdict against N.A.R. and the remaining corporate co-defendants, and the jury awarded $1.78 billion in damages to the plaintiffs. Now, I understand that that's an eye-popping amount. That is a large amount. It obviously has gotten a lot of attention, including from consumers, from members who maybe not have been paying attention to this because it had been going on for 4.5 years at this point. We understand our members are busy. They're out there trying to put food on their tables, provide a roof over their head, and make sure that they're providing services to their seller and buyer clients in a pretty challenging market. So this may not have been something that they were actively following, but now it's real. It's less abstract. We have a jury verdict. It is getting a lot more attention in the media and from consumers. So we understand that the members are getting questions. They're getting questions that maybe they haven't had to answer before. Fundamentally, we believe that the jury reached an outcome that is not supported by the law or the facts presented in the case, and we have already announced that we plan to appeal. Now, why we feel so strongly about this is because we actually have decades of legal precedent which demonstrates that our policies are pro-competitive and pro-consumer. They are not anti-competitive. So we share our members' frustration, we share our members' disappointment in the jury verdict, but we are going to continue to push forward to defend our policies because we believe them to be pro-consumer and we believe them to be good and right and true. So, for example, N.A.R.'s rule does not specify any compensation amount that should be offered. We have always said it could be any amount as low as a penny. And then this past summer, 2023, we were asked if it could be zero. And we said, what is the distinction between a penny and zero as long as it's being transparent and it's being disclosed? So we advise that it could be zero as well. We have many other rules throughout the MLS handbook and N.A.R. policy which expressly prohibit MLSs, associations, and brokers from setting or suggesting any such amount that should be included in that field. The number is completely at the discretion of the listing broker and their client and is always negotiable. More fundamentally, we stand by the benefits of cooperative compensation. This practice that a listing broker making an offer of compensation to buyer brokers who bring a buyer who is ready, willing, and able to purchase the property. Cooperative compensation practice makes markets efficient, transparent, and accessible to a broader range of buyers and consumers, all things that are pro-competitive and pro-consumer. So let's just break this down a little bit. Cooperative compensation benefits sellers because they can attract more qualified buyers for their home. This increases their chance to get the best offer. We're not talking about agent behavior. We're not talking about whether or not agents will be more likely to show the property. What we are talking about is fundamentally what is the consumer behavior. If I'm a buyer who already maybe is struggling to save up money for a down payment in an appreciating market, or to save up money for closing costs and things like that, I want representation. This is the most significant financial transaction I might make in my entire life. I want representation for that, but I might not be able to afford to pay for it out of pocket because of all the other costs involved, or maybe because of the loan product that I'm using, which I'll circle back on in just a minute. But the bottom line is that I might not be able. I want my representation, but I might not be able to pay for it out of pocket. So if I have to write an offer on a property where there's no cooperative compensation involved, I might not be able to write a competitive offer on that listing. So that is how it benefits sellers. It's not about showing property. It's about expanding the pool of buyers that can afford to write an offer on the property, thus increasing competition. But like I said, it also benefits the buyers because now they have more choices of homes and can still afford the professional representation that they need and want to help them navigate through this significant financial transaction. So this is where we get to some of the negative consumer impacts of what the plaintiffs essentially are seeking in these cases. Because without cooperative compensation, many first-time home buyers and lower-income buyers, people from historically underrepresented and underserved communities, first-generation home buyers, couldn't afford to pay for representation out of pocket. Let's just look at like the FHA program, for instance, which has a 3.5% cap on buyer contributions towards closing costs. Well, if the buyers also had to pay for representation on top of that, that could eat into some of their ability to be able to afford to buy the property and still have representation. The VA loan program, as I'm sure many people know, military service members and veterans would be significantly disadvantaged because that program currently prohibits even paying a cent towards cooperative compensation. And we know that our service members, veterans, and their families need this program, and they need representation because many times they're moving from out of town across the country, across the world even, and they need that local representation. So, and even under the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac underwriting guidelines, depending on the loan products and how much money they have saved up, if they had to pay for compensation for their representation, that might end up limiting the amount of a loan that a buyer might be able to qualify for. At the end of the day, realtors know that the MLS policies and rules have benefited buyers and sellers alike for more than 100 years, and that's why we're continuing to defend this. So that's kind of where we are. That's our position on the Burnett verdict. But there's many other things that are happening right now. There's a broader legal landscape that we have to consider. As we've already noted, we plan to appeal the verdict. And this is just the first chapter in a longer legal process. I mean, it's been going on for 5 years, and maybe we're in like the 4th inning right now. The first step, though, is that we actually don't even have a legal judgment to appeal yet at this time. There's a jury verdict, but a judgment has not been entered by the court. Both the plaintiffs and the defendants are going to file briefs with the trial court over the next few months. And so, for example, we would be filing a motion to set aside the jury verdict because it wasn't supported by the law or the facts. We would file a motion for a new trial because of some of the decisions that the judge made in their treatment of the case. We would contest the amount of the award that was awarded by the jury because it was not supported by the facts. In the event that the judge does not grant those motions, then we would be appealing. Our last brief in the post-trial motions is due in, I believe, mid-March. So we're probably looking at, an appeal in April or May at the earliest, really. And so the appeal will be briefed and argued later in 2024. As that moves ahead, as you know, there have been and there probably will continue to be other legal developments. For example, there are other legal actions pending. The Moehrl case is still pending. We filed our motion for summary judgment in order to try to limit the scope of claims or get the matter dismissed before trial back in December. And so the judge will be ruling on the motion for summary judgment. If we do not prevail on that, then we would anticipate a trial in the Moehrl case sometime later in 2024. There have been other cases, copycat lawsuits that have come out since the Burnett verdict. Interestingly enough, it's always been N.A.R.'s position that since it's our rule, if a case has to be filed, it should be against us. But unfortunately, they have been targeting state and local associations, MLSs, and a broader range of real estate brokerages. We are continuing to look for ways in which to legally support our associations and other co-defendants in this, or even in situations where we're not defending. So certainly, you can consult with your counsels on that, because there are other.
Okay. So that is the history lesson of the lawsuits. As we were coming into 2023, what we were seeing was these lawsuits continuing to go on into 2024, 2025, with copycat lawsuits all over. So at the time this video was filmed, it had happened just after we had the guilty verdict. And now they were in this space of trying to figure out if they were going to appeal it, if they were going to put the money on the table to appeal it. And at the time, the thought process was that it would be appealed and they were going to continue to fight it. Then there was a rash of lawsuits filed across the entire nation. Especially, we saw a lot of those here in Texas, with nearly every realtor association in Texas being having these lawsuits filed against them. And so a settlement agreement, National Association of Realtors decided that they were going to go ahead and settle this. And they came in kind of as the hero here. And the agreement to settle this commission puts all of these lawsuits away. It completely stops the lawsuits. All of them now are settled, and we have 5 settlement agreements that we as a profession are agreeing to based on the National Association of Realtors settlement agreement. The first and the proposed settlement has not been signed. So until it's signed, it's not official. But this is the best information that we have today, and the word on the street is that everyone is in favor of this settlement agreement. There was a mediator that was involved. That is a past appellate judge. He is the one that is acting as mediator, and did an extremely good job with this mediation. And they have 5 basic agreements that is going to change the way we do business moving forward. There's no question that there's some significant change coming. But the change that's coming is to force agents to do business exactly the way that Realty Texas has been asking our agents to do business since the very beginning, which is the use of representation agreements. As Matt, the attorney that you just heard from, had alluded to, the cooperative compensation in the MLS was a perfect system. It was set up perfectly. How it became imperfect is because agents began to lean on the offer of compensation as an agreement to be paid, and they would get the check in the mail, so they didn't have to, in their mind, get a buyer representation agreement signed. An agent in Texas doesn't have authorization to be paid unless they have in writing something from the client authorizing them to be paid. So if an agent moves forward in a transaction representing a buyer without a transaction, without an agreement, it is a sub-agency. It means they're a sub-agent for the seller. And the MLS already had provisions for that, didn't they? What happens if you're a sub-agent? What is the compensation for a sub-agent? And it's a different amount. Because we are a contract state, there has to be a contract in order for someone to file a claim or a lawsuit against services rendered. So in order for the buyer to be able to sue someone, they have to have a contract. And if they don't have a contract with their buyer agent, because the buyer agent hasn't signed one, then the contract that is going to be the contract that is pushed forward is actually the contract between the listing agent, the listing broker, and the seller. And so the why we are here today, why these lawsuits happened and how these lawsuits happened, is because of one reality. Agents refused to use buyer representation agreements, period. That's why we're here. It's why it happened. It's why the National Association of Realtors is writing a $400 million check. The first proposed settlement agreement, number one, the agreement the National Association of Realtors has made in order to settle these lawsuits and make them go away, first of them foremost is a release of liability. The agreement would release N.A.R. over 1.5 million realtors, as well as all of our local realtor organizations, all association-owned MLSs, and all brokerages with an N.A.R. member as principal, the broker is a N.A.R. member, that had a residential transaction volume in 2022 of less than 2 billion, which is 99.5% of the brokerages out there. The brokerages that had more than 2 billion were named in the lawsuits themselves, and many of them have already settled. N.A.R. fought to include all the members in the release and was able to ensure more than 1 million members are included. Despite N.A.R. efforts, agents affiliated with Home Services of America and its related companies, the last corporate defendant still litigating the Sitzer Burnett case, are not released under the settlement. So anyone affiliated with Home Services of America is not off the hook, but everybody else is. And now Home Services of America are going to have to figure out how they are going to settle this, like Anywhere did and like Remax did. But N.A.R. has decided to settle, and in doing so is releasing everybody from every claim. But again, there are 5 basic tenets to this proposed settlement agreement, and the first one is a full release of liability. The second agreement is that compensation is going to be moved off of the MLS, meaning that the MLS is no longer going to have a field for compensation. It's important to note that none of these changes are going to happen until sometime mid-July. Between now and July, there will be no changes. In July, you're going to start seeing some significant changes, but that change is simply going to be paperwork related and where we go to look for the cooperative compensation. Because interestingly enough, we were found guilty of a $1.4 billion verdict for cooperative compensation being anti-competitive. But the outcome of the settlement says that cooperative compensation is fine. It's just not fine in the MLS, which is crazy. The MLS is a data syndicator. The MLS is not that big of a deal. We're going to still have an MLS. We're going to still be throwing the properties in there and using it for what the purpose of an MLS really is. For many years, we used to call the MLS an offer of compensation because primarily it was an offer of compensation. And second, it was a way for us to share our listings. The offer of compensation portion of the MLS is simply going away. And now the MLS is going to stand on its own 2 feet as one thing and one thing only, a way for us to share listings and syndicate our listings to third-party websites. That's the only thing that's really changing here. The third proposed settlement is that all members of N.A.R., all brokerages who are affiliated with N.A.R., are now required to use a buyer rep agreement. It is now a federal crime for an agent to aid a buyer without a buyer rep agreement or an agreement that says we don't represent you and you're doing this on your own. We have been saying for a long time, we have to use buyer rep agreements. The buyer rep agreements need to be signed before you start negotiations on a contract so that the consumer can understand the compensation. Cindy Bell, myself, many others have been standing on a soapbox for the last 10 years, screaming as loud as we possibly can, use a buyer rep. Our industry depends on it. Not enough people listened. And so here we are. So now this is forcing the use of buyer representation agreements. And so as I look at this, I see this settlement as a really good thing for our profession because now, instead of us being the only one standing on the soapbox screaming to the world, please use a buyer rep agreement, and then agents coming to us and saying, well, not everyone's requiring them. So if I just transfer my license over here, I can do whatever I want. So maybe I should do that because it's easier for me to get paid that way. Okay, but it's not ethical. And more importantly, you have not been authorized to be paid, and this is going to come back and bite everyone. And it did come back and bite everyone to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. The good silver lining here is that now, after June, or after mid-July rather, now buyers are going to hear the same rhetoric from every agent. We need to have a buyer counseling session. We need to sit down and meet so that we can start the process off correctly by having a good, clear understanding that you're hiring me for services rendered. We're going to talk about compensation, and then we're going to start the process, which is a much cleaner way to start the buyer journey. And interestingly, if we look at the seller journey starts with a listing agreement, doesn't it? It starts with a conversation regarding compensation, doesn't it? We go to the seller's house, we sit down at the table, we have a conversation regarding compensation, we get a listing agreement signed, and many of you are walking away from the table with them circling 6, 7, or 8, and a lot of them circle 7 because they understand the value of representation. Now, we have about 91% of home sellers choosing to hire a real estate professional, and around 9% of consumers choosing to do a for sale by owner option. The for sale by owner option actually had more people doing FSBOs in the 70s and 80s and 90s. The number of people willing to do a for sale by owner has declined year over year, decade over decade to the lowest numbers today. I don't know about you guys. I love all you millennials. I do. But it's like pulling teeth to get them to file a homestead. They don't seem to want to, and lenders, I'm sure you're experiencing the same thing. I need documents, and it's like pulling teeth to get documents out of some of them. The reality is that the people today, they need someone to hold them by the hand and walk them through the transaction. And that's not going to go away. And again, cooperative compensation is not going away. So this particular proposed settlement, item number 3, the use of written agreements, that forcing buyer representation agreements to be used is going to be a good thing from all of you because now they're going to hear this. The buyer's going to hear the same thing no matter who they go to. We need to enter into an agreement. So has anything changed? No. The requirement here is always to start with the buyer representation. It's just now being forced to use a buyer representation, and that's going to help you. The number 4 settlement payout, and remember that the summary judgment was 1.78 billion. N.A.R. agreed to pay $418 million over approximately 4 years. So N.A.R. is taking a $418 million hit. Keep in mind that Anywhere already paid over 100 million, and Remax paid over 70 million. And so hundreds of millions have already been paid, but N.A.R. is pinning up almost $500 million to make all of these lawsuits go away. And I think all of us are going to be happy at looking at number 5 when we're going to get there at what the settlement agreement number 5 is. But we're going to talk about the due structure at N.A.R. and how we think this is all going to affect us, having our National Association of Realtors having to carry that bag for all of us. But item number 5, which blows my mind, truly, is that N.A.R. gets to continue saying that we didn't do anything wrong. And part of the summary judgment says in this agreement that we have chosen in a proposed settlement agreement is that no one has done anything wrong. It's painful to write a $418 million check when you have right under it that you did nothing wrong. But N.A.R. has long maintained, and we continue to believe, that cooperative compensation and N.A.R.'s current policies are good things and that benefits buyers and sellers. They promote access to property ownership, particularly for lower and middle income buyers who have a difficult enough time saving for down payment. It opens up the entry gate for home ownership by allowing the seller to use some of their proceeds to help the buyer have a guided expert walk them through one of the largest purchases of their life. Do I think that the commission structures are going to change? Only so much in how our conversations are being put together, but not in terms of dollar amount. In fact, this same attorney that you just heard from, Matt, towards the end of that video said something that many ABR instructors have been using as their soundbite. They said, let's look to see what would happen if cooperating broker, if the buyer agency were to vanish overnight. What would that mean? It would mean that most attorneys would have to get involved. Attorneys, if an attorney were to list a home, he said, you're taking all the risk. When attorneys take a deal on contingency, they do so on a much larger percentage, like 25 or 30%. An attorney said, look, if you want to pay me a flat fee, you'll pay me an hourly rate, or you will pay me 50% up front and 50% on the close. But if you want me to take all the risk and take photos and do all of this work and maybe it not sell and me get paid nothing, then that means that I'm taking it on contingency. And that means that I'm going to charge 30% and I'm going to take 30% of proceeds. And that's what's going to happen if attorneys take over our role. It's not that you're going to see commissions decrease. You're going to see 3xing of the commissions, not a doubling, but a tripling of the commissions that are being paid. So it underscores that when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of dollars in transactions and the fees that are being paid, it's pennies compared to what the attorneys would charge. So the 5 settlement agreements again is number 1, release of liability for all members. Number 2, compensation is moved outside the MLS. We have written agreements requiring buyer representation agreements. N.A.R. is going to pay the $418 million settlement agreement. And number 5, N.A.R. continues to say, we did nothing wrong. If we take a little bit of the experts out of the actual documents that were filed, and again, I put those in our chat today. It's the proposed settlement. Here's some of the language in it. And then I've got 23 Q&A questions that as an N.A.R. director, they've given us some talking points. We're going to go through each one of those. And by the time we are done with these talking points, you guys are going to have a very good understanding of where we are and where things are going. But these next 2 slides, I want to just read a little bit here. It says, whereof extensive arm's length settlement negotiations have taken place between plaintiffs, co-lead counsel, and counsel for the National Association of Realtors, including several telephonic mediations with a nationally recognized and highly experienced mediator, 2 mediations with a retired federal district judge, and a mediation with a federal magistrate judge. Whereas the actions will continue, including against certain other defendants, unless plaintiffs separately settle with those defendants. Whereas plaintiffs have conducted an extensive investigation into the facts and the law regarding the claims asserted in the actions, including more than 4 years of fact and expert discovery, and have concluded that a settlement with the National Association of Realtors according to the terms set below is fair, reasonable, and adequate, and in the best interests of the plaintiffs and the settlement class. So this is part of our settlement agreement. The magistrate judge and everyone says that it is fair, and it is reasonable and adequate to settle this $1.4 billion lawsuit and not continue the litigation that was harming us as a profession. As these lawsuits are being filed, it is taking the focus away from the brokerages. Now they are in a defensive posture, as well as nearly every one of our over 800 realtor organizations across the United States are now in a defensive posture. And instead of leading, they are defending us in these lawsuits, and it's making us move the needle off of focusing on how we can be better in defending ourselves. The lawsuits are not helping anyone. The second part of the proposed settlement I want to read is it says, whereas the National Association of Realtors believes that it is not liable for the claims asserted and has good defenses to the plaintiff's claims and meritorious summary judgment and post-trial motions, but nevertheless has decided to enter in the settlement agreement to avoid further expense, inconvenience, and the distraction and burdensome of protracted litigation to obtain the nationwide releases, orders, and judgment contemplated by the settlement agreement, and to put to rest with finality all the claims that plaintiffs and settlement class members have or could have asserted against the released parties, as defined below. So basically, N.A.R. said, look, we're not guilty of anything. We haven't done anything wrong. But this has gotten so far out of control and so ridiculous that we're going to write this $400 million check because we think that that is the best thing for our realtor class, for our realtor organizations, and all of the 1.45 million realtors out there trying to put food on our table for our families. Here is how that $418 million is going to be dispersed. For the first 30 days, the National Association of Realtors is going to pony up $5 million and put it in an escrow account. Within 90 days, the National Association of Realtors is going to pony up $197 million and put that into an escrow account. No later than 1 year, they're going to, after the $197 million has been put in the escrow account, they're required to then add another 72. The following year, they have to add another 72 million. And then on the final year, the final payment is going to have to be made, which is just over 80 million. So the Q&A. Why did N.A.R. into the settlement? Why did they agree to the settlement? Why did they just not just go ahead and let us hash this out in court and let us be victorious? Since the litigation began, N.A.R. has worked consistently to reach a resolution with the plaintiffs. the people who filed this lawsuit in the first place. N.A.R. has always wanted to reduce the significant strain on our members and provide a path forward for the industry. And from the beginning of this litigation, we had two goals: secure a release of liability for as many of our members, associations, and MLSs as we could, and preserve the choices consumers have regarding real estate services and compensation. This proposed settlement achieves both of these goals and provides a path for us to move forward and continue our work to preserve and to protect and to advance the right to real estate for all. Number two, what are the key terms of the agreement? First, release of liability. The agreement would release N.A.R., over 1 million N.A.R. members, all state, territorial, and local realtor associations, all association-owned MLSs, all brokerages with N.A.R. members as principal, like us, whose residential transaction volume in 2022 was $2 billion or below, from any liability for the types of claims brought in these cases on behalf of home sellers related to broker commissions. N.A.R. fought to include all members in the release and was able to ensure more than 1 million members are included. Despite N.A.R.'s efforts, agents affiliated with Home Services of America and its related companies, the last corporate defendant still litigating the Sitzer Burnett case because they didn't do what Anywhere and Remax did by settling, and they continued moving forward, they have to go ahead and take those cases to completion. We believe that they will be settling here in the next 30 days. But they are currently not released under the agreement, but that doesn't affect us, and it truly doesn't affect the profession. The settlement agreement provides a mechanism for nearly all brokerage entities that had a residential transaction volume in 22 that exceeded 2 billion in MLSs not wholly owned by realtor associations to obtain releases efficiently if they choose to. In the 100 plus settlement agreement, there is a mechanism for those people who are not under the 2 billion, but rather over the 2 billion, for them to have a mechanism for them to also have a release if they want to pony up the money. Compensation offers moved off of the MLS. N.A.R. has agreed to put in place a new rule prohibiting offers of compensation on the MLS. Offers of compensation could continue to be an option consumers can pursue off MLS through negotiation and consultation with real estate professionals. And sellers can offer buyer concessions on MLS still. If a seller wants to offer a seller concession, which is different than a commission, they can still offer concessions in the MLS. They just can't put commissions in the MLS. The reality is, the MLS as a tool for us to know how much the listing broker is paying is simply a tool for agents to simplify how we know what the compensation will be. That has nothing to do with our agreement with our consumer. We were supposed to first have a buyer representation agreement and have already agreed to compensation, and then let the buyer know when thresholding them on our property what they were offering in terms of compensation on that property, and would it mean an additional payment for them or not. That's the way this was supposed to work. Nothing has changed. We're just going to have to look somewhere else to find out where that commission is. That is literally the only change here. The other agreement is written agreements for MLS participants acting for buyers. While N.A.R. has been advocating for the use of written buyer rep agreements for many years, if not decades, in this settlement, we've agreed to require MLS participants, and hear this, guys, working with buyers to enter into written representation agreements with their buyers, and this change will go into effect in mid-July 2024. When you dig into the settlement agreement, it actually says a buyer representation agreement before a buyer can be showed a home. You cannot show a buyer a home without a buyer representation agreement after sometime July 2024. No different than if this was in 1985 and I said, you will not be able to put a for sale sign in that yard until you have a listing agreement. And here we are, 30 years later, 40 years later, and everything is just fine. The settlement payment N.A.R. would pay is $418 million over approximately 4 years. We've talked about that, and it's a substantial sum, and it will be incumbent on N.A.R. to use the remaining resources that they have the most effective way possible, continuing, because now N.A.R. is going to be a somewhat cash-strapped organization. Any organization writing a $400 million check over 5 years is going to have to reprioritize their initiatives, and they're going to have to reprioritize their spending. And so for those people who serve on the N.A.R. Budget Committee, I do not envy them right now. N.A.R. gets to continue to deny any wrongdoing. N.A.R. has long maintained and they continue to believe, and so do I and all the rest of us, that cooperative compensation and N.A.R.'s current policies are a good thing that benefit buyers and sellers. They promote access to property ownership. It lowers the bar for entry for people who need representation, and that's just about everyone, to walk them through this process and have their compensation paid for by the seller. No one can tell a seller that they can't pay buyer cooperating brokerage, and we don't believe anything is going to change based on that. And at the end of this, I will do some Q&A and answer all of your questions. But as we get through these questions, I think most questions will be answered. Does this settlement mean that N.A.R. is admitting that the plaintiff's allegations are true? The answer is no. The settlement makes clear that N.A.R. continues to deny any wrongdoing in connection with the multiple listing cooperative compensation model rule, the MLS model rule that we have today that's changing in mid-July. It has always been N.A.R.'s goal to resolve this litigation in a way that preserves consumer choice and protects our members to the greatest extent possible. This settlement achieves both of those goals. This agreement significantly reduces liability nationwide for over 1 million N.A.R. members, all state, territorial, and realtor organizations, association-owned MLSs, and all brokerages with an N.A.R. member as a principal, like us, that had a residential transaction volume in 22 of 2 billion or less. Ultimately, continuing to litigate would have hurt members, and it would have hurt small business. The agreement provides a path forward for our industry and for N.A.R. Number 4, by changing cooperative compensation policy, aren't you admitting that was problematic? N.A.R. contends no. The settlement makes clear that N.A.R. continues to deny any wrongdoing in connection with the multiple listing service. N.A.R. has long maintained, and we continue to believe, that cooperative compensation is a good thing. With the settlement, N.A.R. is confident and its members can still achieve all of the goals that we have today through this settlement. Number 6, is it possible for offers of compensation to be conveyed through channels other than the MLS? The answer is yes. Offers of compensation could continue to be an option consumers can pursue off MLS through negotiation and consultation with real estate professionals, and sellers can offer buyer concessions on an MLS. For example, concessions, meaning if they're offering buy down points or whatever, can still be in the MLS, but all of the agreement between brokers, and by the way, that's called that for a reason. The brokers are making an agreement, the agents aren't. An agreement between brokers has to now be signed. And guess what? Texas already has one of those. And at the end, we're going to talk about the paperwork that you're going to need. And it's 3 simple documents that puts all of this to rest on every transaction. Will this prohibition save money for buyers and sellers? Interesting question. Meaning, are we going to receive less compensation regarding this outcome? As N.A.R. is maintained through the litigation, nothing in N.A.R.'s current policies, including the MLS model policy, has increased costs for buyers or sellers. This settlement would preserve the choice consumers have regarding real estate services and compensation. After the new rule goes into effect, listing brokers and sellers could continue, and we will, offer compensation for buyer brokerage services. But such offers simply can't be communicated through any channel in the MLS. The settlement expressly provides that sellers may communicate seller concessions, such as buyer closing costs, via the MLS. And they keep pushing that aspect of it. How does this settlement really going to affect our MLSs? The agreement would release association-owned MLSs from liability, and while the release excludes MLSs that are not owned by realtor associations, and if we look at the model Bryan College Station as an example, they are a broker-owned MLS. Because they are a broker-owned MLS, N.A.R. has no jurisdiction over them. And guess what? Offer of compensation will remain in that particular MLS because it's not owned by the organization. I've already heard a push from many realtor organizations to take their MLS what is it called? The extra jurisdictional committee. Every single association has a charter from the MLS, and when they have a charter from N.A.R. and own an MLS, they're subject to the N.A.R. MLS model policies. If the MLS is owned by some entity that is not N.A.R., they can continue, and we're going to be seeing a lot of MLSs move outside of the umbrella, but that means opening up the MLS to non-realtor members. That's a conversation that's taking place as I'm a board of governor for the Central Texas Regional MLS. We met yesterday, and substantive dialogue and letter of intent is coming from our Central Texas MLS to each one of our shareholders regarding this very topic about opening up the MLS to non-members so that it's not just a realtor MLS, but it is a real estate licensee MLS. And you're going to start seeing more of that too. Is that a bad thing? Of course it's not. So it says, while the release excludes MLS that are not wholly owned by realtor associations, the agreement provided a mechanism for those MLSs to obtain releases efficiently if they chose to. The mechanism includes opting into the MLS practice changes that are a part of the agreement and paying a per-scriber fee to the settlement fund. N.A.R. has agreed to put in place a new rule prohibiting offers of compensation on the MLS. This will go into effect sometime in July. Additionally, we have agreed to require MLS participants working with buyers to enter into written representation agreements with their buyers, also again mid-July. How does the settlement affect home sellers and home buyers? This settlement preserves the choice consumers have regarding real estate services and compensation. After the new rule goes into effect, listing brokers and sellers could continue to offer compensation for buyer brokerage services, but such offers just can't be communicated through the MLS, as we have said before. MLS participants acting for buyers would be required to enter into written agreements with their buyers before touring a home. And it's just very important that you guys get that before you can threshold a buyer into a property. A representation agreement will need to be signed. These agreements can help consumers understand exactly what services and value will be provided and for how much. And had we, as a profession, been good at this about the buyer representation agreements, we would not be here today. So it's time for everyone to take personal responsibility who has closed transactions without a buyer representation agreement to say, I'm part of that. How will buyer brokers get paid now? We have long believed that it is the interest of the sellers and the buyers and their brokers to make an offer of compensation, but using the MLS to communicate offers of compensation would no longer be an option. Offers of compensation could continue to be an option consumers can pursue off MLS, and they've given us some ideas, like a brokerage website, for instance. And we're going to cover that towards the end today of how we're going to be how we're going to be disclosing the amount that our seller has agreed to because the listing agreement is not being modified. The number will still be there. We can put in our standard fee and the fee that we are offering the cooperating broker. We just have to place that piece of information on our website, which means we're going to have to put a link to that particular listing into the MLS. The MLS has a website field. So we're going to take that single property site page that's on our website and put a link to the MLS. So instead of looking at the bottom of the one page MLS, you're going to click a link that takes them to the broker website. And on that page, there will be the offer of compensation. That is the biggest disruption we're going to see is brokerages having to facilitate how they're going to make that disclosure. Some of us have already asked the question, what if we simply fill out a agreement between brokers and we put in all the information about how much we're offering the buyer side and simply upload that as an MLS attachment? Will that suffice? Will that be allowed? We're going to do that until they tell us we can't anymore. And I think a lot of brokers are just going to be uploading agreements between brokers and the attachments until the MLS decides whether or not that's going to be allowed. But we're going to start that practice in coming up on the beginning of April. The types of compensation available for buyer brokers would continue to take multiple forms depending on broker-consumer negotiations. Fixed fee commissions, concessions from the seller, a portion of the listing broker's compensation, which is unchanged from what we have today. Compensation will continue to be negotiated and should always be negotiated between brokerages and the consumers that they serve. How is N.A.R. going to come up with the money? Or do they have the money? The answer is they have the money. One of the critical advantages of the agreement is that N.A.R. can amortize this $400 million over 4 years. Now they have the first $5 million payment, and then in the second year, a $100 million payment. And they have that money and they've already got it. It's just going to be function of the Finance Committee of the National Association of Realtors to figure out how they're going to change and reprioritize their initiatives to make sure that they can not blow through all of their reserves. But this is a significant amount of the reserves that N.A.R. has. N.A.R. has bylaws. N.A.R. bylaws, and as a director, we get to see those and see how these meetings are ran. I can tell you that there is a requirement in the bylaws of N.A.R. to have a certain amount of reserves on hand at all times. The very first motion that we're going to be making as N.A.R. directors is to modify our bylaws to modify the amount of reserves that we have in order to make this payment. How does a settlement change N.A.R.'s value proposition? Why should real estate professionals continue to be an N.A.R. member after the news? Well, first of all, they just indemnified you. They just took one for the team. They just ponied up $419 million so all of you don't have to. Let me throw this out there. Real estate agents often walk away with 70%, 80%, 90% of the commission. Where are all of these billions of dollars worth of commissions right now? 80%, 70%, 90% are sitting in real estate agents' bank accounts. But the real estate brokerages who received 10%, 20%, 30%, they made hundreds of millions of dollars of outpays to settle this. To stop that from happening, N.A.R. took one for the team. And so I think that increases the value proposition of the National Association of Realtors. And we should be proud that an organization like that would step forward and indemnify its members like it has. And after all, it's not their fault that agents won't use buyer representation agreements. We have been in the ABR class teaching ABR and the use of buyer representation agreements, and in GRI and all of the education that N.A.R. has been a proponent of educating agents to use buyer representation agreements from the very beginning. And yet, despite their efforts, they still came in and saved the day in the end. We are confident that this agreement provides a path for N.A.R. to move forward and to continue our work to preserve, protect, and advance the right of real property for all, and to continue our code of ethics and our journey. N.A.R. fought to include all members in the release and was able to ensure more than 1 million members are included. We will continue to deliver unparalleled value to and to advocate on behalf of realtors, including through our learning opportunities and resources, research, and members' tools. So then what becomes the value of the MLS? MLS have always provided significant value beyond communicating offers of compensation, hasn't it? It enables comprehensive marketplaces, access to inventory, and widespread advertising, incentivizes local brokers' participation, ensures reliable data access, creates connections between buyers and sellers that ordinarily or maybe not have been found because we have all of the data in one place. And that is the beauty of the MLS. Now, I do believe that it's going to also force MLS consolidation. That's another good thing that I have been pushing for. The reason we created Central Texas Regional MLS was to help create more regional MLSs. And so MLSs can come together. So we have all of the data in one place. And we're going to see that continue. I serve on the N.A.R. MLS committee, Texas Realtors MLS committee as an N.A.R. director and a governor for Central Texas MLS. And I'm an instructor for Texas Realtors and part of REBAC and ABR and GRI. And I can tell you that I am inundated. I am inundated with daily communication regarding all of these lawsuits and the settlements and what's going on. And I'm hearing from the attorneys and I'm listening to our N.A.R. chairman and our Texas Realtors chairman and all of the education that's coming out. And the one takeaway that I have from being in a spectator front row seat, an active participant in all of this, is that nothing is really changing other than where eyeballs go to see where the commission is. Yet, I pick up my phone and I go and I look at the news and it says the sky is falling, but I go outside and it's a beautiful sunny day. So the National Association of Realtors' primary duty is the PR firm for us real estate agents. So maybe they took one for the team, but one thing that they need to do better, and believe me, us directors uh, are making sure that N.A.R. is hearing this, is that we need to take control of this message. We need to be doing op-eds. We need to be on CNN and we need to be talking about compensation more, and they need to be leading this conversation. If you want to talk about conspiracies, well, there may be one hidden here somewhere. The speed and fervor in which these lawsuits were filed is unparalleled. Over 1,000 copycat lawsuits were all filed within 1 week, which without the use of AI, would need a team of 100 lawyers or more to be able to pull something like that off. And they believe that it was lawyers that were doing it. So there's big money behind these lawsuits. It's not a seller in Missouri that's upset. There is some big engine behind this. At the same time that all of these copycat lawsuits were happening, you'll also notice that the National Association of Realtors got sucker punched with a allegation of sexual harassment by Kenny Parcell, who was our 2022 chairman. He entered into a consensual sexual relationship with a staff person at the National Association of Realtors who happened to be the communications director of the National Association of Realtors, who took her op-ed to the New York Times. And that op-ed made for headline news that the National Association of Realtors has a toxic climate, that the word creepy was used in the op-ed, and that word has been thrown out everywhere that we can see. And then you fast forward that to Tracy Casper accelerating into Kenny Parcells' position, her pushing forward with the lawsuit within 3 months of being in the chair as chairman of N.A.R. was blackmailed. She resigned as chairman of the N.A.R. and Kevin Sears is now in the seat. And he was supposed to be our 2025 chairman, who has been accelerated in 2023 as being chairman and now serving what was supposed to be his incoming chairman year as chairman for the National Association of Realtors. So the communications director, who's responsible for holding the torch and communicating to the news and communicating to all the third parties about the value of the real estate agent, the value of the MLS, and to be holding the torch for us, um, either because of Kenny Parcells' bad behavior or a payout that happened somewhere. We see a lot of these lawsuits coming at a time where also N.A.R. was also having leadership literally tossed out onto the street, as well as a resignation from our CEO, Bob Goldberg, who was forced to resign. So not only did we lose 3 presidents in 3 months, we also lost a CEO of the organization, and we had to bring in a new CEO who is an interim CEO who is outside the Realtor organization. So for our realtor organization to continue fighting these lawsuits with its leadership team scrapped from the CEO to 3 presidents in a row, that's a very difficult proposition. And so again, another reason why I think that they were forced to go ahead and settle. And the settlement agreement that was reached is pretty good. It just cripples the MLS. It changes the MLS. It changes the offer of compensation in the MLS. And CoStar and Zillow and others wanted to see that happen. And so maybe we'll start seeing some MLS offerings out there that's outside the realtor organization. But again, that's not going to change compensation between brokers. What should listing brokers advise their clients about the prohibition of offers of compensation in MLS? Listing brokers should inform their clients that offers of compensation will no longer be an option in the MLS. And this change will not prevent offers of cooperation off MLS, and it will not prevent sellers from offering buyer commissions or concessions, or rather, it's not going to stop sellers from offering a seller concession in the MLS, but it's not going to allow compensation in the MLS. We talked about that. Why was prohibiting the publication of compensation offers in the MLS part of the settlement? Well, N.A.R. has long maintained, and we continue to believe, that cooperative compensation in N.A.R.'s current policies are a good thing that benefit buyers and sellers. We also acknowledge that continuing to litigate would have hurt members and their small businesses. So they've agreed to put in place a new rule just prohibiting the offer of compensation in the MLS. This is consistent with N.A.R.'s longstanding position that prohibiting all offers of cooperation compensation entirely would harm consumers and would be inconsistent with real estate laws in many states that authorize them. So we can't, this lawsuit is not going to stop compensation. It's just going to change where we offer the compensation for the cooperating broker. Is it possible for offers of compensation to be conveyed through channels other than the MLS? Probably one of the most important questions that could be asked, right? And the answer is, of course, yes. Offers of compensation could continue to be an option and will. Consumers can pursue off MLS through negotiation and consultation with real estate professionals, and sellers can offer buyer concessions on an MLS. The compensation can be anywhere on a website, a third-party service that pops up that does a unilateral off compensation, and a service that's not owned by N.A.R. How does the settlement affect state and territorial local associations? The agreement would release all the state, territorial, and local realtor associations from liability for the types of claims brought in these cases on behalf of home sellers, meaning that once this is signed and agreed to, it's done. These lawsuits of anti competitive behavior regarding commissions will be put to bed forever, into perpetuity, as they say. Number 18 are GRI and ABR and REBAC and REBI and all of those societies like WCR, are they going to be indemnified? And the answer is yes, they will, along with the realtor organizations. How will offer of compensations be communicated if brokers can't use MLSs? Doesn't this just make broker compensation less transparent? Offers of compensation could continue to be an option consumers can pursue off MLS. Sellers can offer buyer concessions if they want, but realtors are always required to protect and promote the interests. Really is going to come down to brokerage websites or a third party service who's going to step up and allow us to enter that offer of compensation. How quickly do you expect the settlement to be reviewed and or approved by the court? It's going to take several months, maybe more. There's a strong grounds for the court to approve the settlement because it's in the best interest of all parties, and both of the mediators in the text that I read you earlier today agreed that it is the best thing for the marketplace and it is fair. The mediator saying that they approve and acknowledge that this mediation should take place and this settlement should take place. That is what we were looking for to see. So the road is paved for this to be signed. What were the key factors that influenced N.A.R.'s decision to choose the legal path it did for the settlement? N.A.R. explored settling through the litigation and also carefully considered the other legal options available to him. So what were the options? Appealing. A win on appeal would only have addressed the verdict in the Sitzer Burnett case, not all of the copycat. So if they had won one, they still have all these other lawsuits to deal with, which is why the copycat lawsuits were filed, because they knew that if they fought this one, then if they have over 1,000 other lawsuits out there, that they're going to have to just continue defending themselves into ever. So it was good for them to put this to bed and settle. Chapter 11, just reorganize out and say, look, we don't have the cash, so we're just going to bankruptcy ourselves out. That would have left all of our 1 million, 1.5 million realtors on the hook for it, as well as the brokerages and the associations. That would have left to continued uncertainty and liability and risk. Chapter 11 would also have paused the litigation against N.A.R., but not the other defendants, which were all the other brokerages. So it would have been saving themselves, grabbing a life raft and letting everybody else drown. Ultimately, while N.A.R. continues to believe that it's not liable, they've been screaming about buyer reps for a long time, they're not liable for the home seller claims related to broker commissions, and that we have strong arguments challenging the Sitzer Burnett verdict because it was without merit. They decided to reach the settlement to put claims to rest for all of us. Ultimately, while N.A.R. continues to believe that it's not liable for home seller claims related to broker commissions, that this is the best thing for everyone. And we've got three more of these. What was N.A.R.'s overarching strategy with the settlement, and why did N.A.R. choose to not more actively advocate for its position in the public domain? Why didn't they use their influence on the Hill? Why didn't they pull out a bullhorn and start screaming? Since the litigation began, they've consistently worked to reach a resolution with the plaintiffs. In the months since the Sitzer verdict, they redoubled those efforts. As in common with negotiating complex settlements, there's a need to maintain confidentiality in a lawsuit and effectively navigate complex legal considerations. Imagine updating 1.5 million realtors in a confidential manner. Not possible. They couldn't even keep it confidential with a 900-member board of directors. In fact, there's many of us directors. There's 900 N.A.R. directors. I'm one. I found out that this was settled on Inman. And less than an hour later, we received an email from our National Association of Realtors Chairman Kevin Sears, letting us know that they did in fact reach an agreement. So it hit Inman before N.A.R. could even tell the board of directors what had happened. And so there was a need for confidentiality. We've always wanted to reduce the significant strain on our members and provide a path forward for the industry. And from the beginning of this litigation, we had two goals. They talked about that goal before, release the liability for our members, associations, and MLSs, and to preserve the choice consumers have regarding compensation, and to make sure that compensation was not stricken. Cooperative compensation was not stricken, and it wasn't. So there is no change in a seller being able to pay the buyer agent's compensation. This proposed settlement achieves both of those goals and provides a path forward for us. Okay. Why is N.A.R. paying so much more to settle than the corporate defendants? This settlement was heavily negotiated and is based on N.A.R.'s ability to pay. N.A.R. has secured a release of liability for everyone, and that was a big deal, including the N.A.R. Member boards. But remember, this was a $1.78 billion verdict. And so they were able to settle it for less than 1/3. Does the settlement affect N.A.R.'s ability to continue operating? The answer is no. They're confident that the agreement provides a path for them to move forward by amortizing the $400 million over the course of 4 years. The settlement is a substantial amount of money, and it's going to be incumbent on N.A.Rs to use the remaining resources that they have very effectively to continue delivering on their core mission. The Finance Committee and Strategic Planning Committee will remain critical in reviewing and providing guidance about N.A.R's operating budget to help ensure that N.A.R will continue to deliver unparalleled value and to advocate on behalf of realtors, including through our learning opportunities and our GRI, ABR, and our designation courses, as well as research, RPR, and all the member tools that are being delivered from the National Association of Realtors, and as well as its influence on the Hill. There are strong grounds for the court to approve the settlement because it is in the best interest of all parties. Number 24. Does the settlement affect N.A.R's ability to continue operating? And the answer is no. Will N.A.R raise dues or levy an assessment on members to fund the settlement? The N.A.R membership due for 2024 will not change because of this payment. N.A.R can't make a claim right now because it's going to be up to the board of directors to determine of whether or not the N.A.R dues are going to be modified. But the reality is, what will be modified without any ambiguity is the bylaws, because we have to lower the amount of reserves that N.A.R can hold in order for us to make the payment. Now, the question is going to be, are they going to be on a endless quest to recapitalize on those reserves, or are they going to button down the hatches and work under a new budget? That is up to the finance committees and the future leadership to determine. But throughout the remainder of 2024, there will be no fees or additional assessments for the rest of 2024. We did see in 2023, the National Association of Realtors did levy an assessment for the That's Who We Are campaign that they have had on national television regarding the use of a realtor and why you should use one. It was the first time the N.A.R had had commercials running on TV since 2003. I suspect that we are going to continue seeing that. I think that PR is going to be the biggest thing that N.A.R is going to have to focus their attention on. Are independent MLSs affected by the prohibition? Independent MLSs are not required to prohibit offers of compensation on the MLS pursuant to the agreement unless they choose to opt into the settlement, in which case they will need to agree to the practice changes. So if the non-MLS continues to opt into offers of compensation and it's owned by and it's not owned by N.A.R, they could be sued. It's possible. And then they would have to protect themselves. But if they opt into the settlement agreement, then they have to remove that. So again, all of these MLSs who are having conversations regarding whether or not they are going to keep compensation or not, they have to determine whether or not the risk score is good enough for them. And that is what we all do, is mitigating risk. Does this prohibition affect the compensation amount paid to the listing broker? Compensation would continue to be negotiable and should always be negotiated between the agents and consumers. The answer is no. The seller, what's happened in the last 20 years is going to continue on in the next 20 years. How does this affect the existing listing agreements that authorize an offer of compensation to be made in the MLS? After the new rule goes into effect, listing agreements should be amended to reflect that offers of compensation cannot be communicated via the MLS. The settlement expressly provides that sellers may communicate seller concessions such as buyer closing costs in the MLS, but the only change to the listing agreement that Texas Realtors is working on right now is modifying the language stating that the commission amount will be added to the MLS. which is literally one sentence. How would the prohibition affect pending transactions? It won't. For those of you who are listing properties in April and in May, all the way into June, the paperwork will remain the same and they are unaffected. It's not until July when the rule change happens. We're going to see the N.A.R. directors at our DC meetings coming up. For those of you who like to go to the Hill Visit meetings, I definitely recommend it. We are certainly going, and I have an obligation to attend, and I will be there. And we will be making the rule change by the board of directors in the July meeting. What steps will buyer agents, brokers, need to take to ensure that they're being paid for their services? N.A.R. has long encouraged its members to use written agreements because they help consumers understand exactly what services and value will be provided and for how much. In fact, the settlement provides that MLS participants working with buyers must enter into a written representation agreement with those buyers before touring a home. These agreements can help consumers understand exactly what services and value will be provided and for how much. The types of compensation available for buyer brokers would continue to take multiple forms, including but not limited to fixed fee commissions, concessions from the seller, and a portion of the listing broker's compensation, as it always has. And there are 4 more questions. Does this mean buyers won't have to use a buyer broker to purchase a property? As always, the consumer chooses whether to hire a real estate professional, and we don't see that changing. In fact, over time, we've seen more and more buyers choosing to hire a real estate agent. Research has confirmed that consumers find great value in the services provided by the buyer broker, and we continue to believe it's imperative for buyer brokers to clearly articulate what services and value they are providing to consumers, as we have always recommended. Can a buyer request a listing broker to pay compensation to the buyer broker? Offers of compensation will continue to be an option. Consumers can pursue off MLS. So the answer is yes. Compensation would continue to be negotiable and should always be negotiated between agents and brokerages for the consumers they serve. So again, nothing is changing. Does this mean buyers won't have to use a buyer broker to purchase property? I think that was a duplicated slide. It was. All right. So that is the end of the Q&A portion of the N.A.R. And by the way, every one of those Q&As came from N.A.R. Lisa Jackson, who is the lead attorney for the National Association of Realtors. There is a 3-minute video that I'm going to have you guys watch really quick from your leadership at the National Association of Realtors, because they want to talk to you directly as well about what all of this means. So let's hear from our N.A.R. leadership. Make sure I'm sharing the sound properly. Some of you may have seen this before, but this is our CEO, our attorney, Katie Johnson, and Kevin
Hello,
Cruz.
I'm Katie Johnson, the Chief Legal Officer of the National Association of Realtors. I'm here to share key details of the settlement agreement that would resolve nationwide claims brought by home sellers concerning the MLS Cooperative Compensation Model Rule. Like all settlements of class action litigation, it is subject to court approval. First, N.A.R. has secured a broad release of liability. The agreement would resolve claims against N.A.R., over 1 million N.A.R. members, all state, territorial, and local realtor associations, all association-owned MLSs, and all brokerages with an N.A.R. member as a principal that had a residential transaction volume in 2022 of $2 billion or below. In addition, for nearly all brokerages that had a residential transaction volume in 2022 that exceeded $2 billion, and for MLSs not wholly owned by realtor associations, N.A.R. has secured in the agreement a mechanism for them to obtain releases efficiently if they so choose. We fought to include all members in the release, but unfortunately 2 groups were not included. The release does not include members for any time that they were affiliated with our co-defendant, Home Services of America. The release also does not include employees of the remaining defendants named in the cases covered by this settlement. Turning to the second key term of the settlement, we have agreed to pay $418 million over approximately 4 years to resolve what could have ultimately been a judgment of more than $5 billion. Third, we have agreed to put in place a new MLS rule prohibiting offers of broker compensation on an MLS. The rule change is expected to go into effect in July of this year. This change will not prevent offers of cooperative compensation off an MLS, and it will not prevent sellers from offering buyer concessions on an MLS. For example, concessions for buyer closing costs. Fourth, we have also agreed to enact a new rule that would require MLS participants working with buyers to enter into written agreements with their buyers. This rule change is also expected to go into effect in July of this year. Using buyer brokerage agreements will mandate what we have long encouraged our members to do: enter into written agreements that help consumers understand exactly what services and value will be provided and for how much. The decision to settle was not made lightly. Ultimately, N.A.R. entered into this agreement to avoid protracted litigation, obtain the nationwide releases, and preserve consumer choice. As for next steps, this settlement is subject to court approval, which is expected to take several months or longer. We will continue to keep you updated on the process and on the implementation of new rules. Please also check out competition.realtor. And now I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Katie, thank you for that explanation and for the commitment to our association and those we serve. Throughout our history, we have evolved to adapt to the ever-changing real estate landscape. This settlement represents a pivotal moment for our association and our industry, and I have full confidence in our ability to evolve once more to do what is needed to lead our members for the years to come. There was no perfect option for resolving this litigation. This settlement will bring changes for all of us, and as a fellow member of the National Association of Realtors and a practicing real estate broker, I feel them personally. But I also know this resolution means we can continue to do our jobs. From the start of this litigation, we knew we had a profound obligation to reach a resolution that's best not just for the National Association of Realtors, but for our members and our industry. That's why we worked diligently to reach an agreement that would release as many of our members and industry participants as possible. It was not enough to simply resolve the lawsuits for the association alone. Importantly, this settlement serves American consumers as well. The National Association of Realtors will continue in the same way that it has for 116 years to serve its members, buyers, sellers, and all others involved in the sale of real estate by providing tools, resources, and education that support and advocate for Americans' abilities to freely buy, sell, lease, and transfer real property. Buyers and sellers will continue to have many options when it comes to compensating their brokers, and compensation, of course, will continue to be negotiable. Buyers and sellers will continue to be guided by our members' skill, care, and diligence during the process of buying and selling a home. Together with our CEO, Nakia Wright, and our leadership team, dedicated staff, and the countless volunteer members who work every day to strengthen our association, I will work tirelessly to fulfill this commitment. To support these efforts, I will be creating a new strategic task force composed of experts from both inside and outside of our organization to ensure that we continue to innovate in ways that best meet the emerging needs of our members. I'll leave you with this. Right now, my first priority is to help members understand the settlement and how it will affect their businesses. But we must all continue to work to demonstrate our value as realtors to buyers, sellers, regulators, elected officials, the media, and more. In the days, weeks, and months ahead, we will hold a series of town halls and briefings to provide more information to help you navigate these changes. In closing, I have confidence in our ability to work together to strengthen our association and our industry. Thank you.
Kevin Sears and Lisa Jackson, National Association of Realtors attorney and CEO. I have 3 more slides for you, and then we will open it up to Q&A. First slide is our one-page buyer representation agreement. It was now required, it has always been required as a Realty Texas policy to get this document signed prior to showing a home to a prospective buyer or a prospective tenant. Offer of compensation is not buying homes, but it is compensation helping any purchaser. And so that includes tenants. You will need to get these signed. The other form is the representation disclosure TXR form 1417. This form is going to be required in your rooms. The 1417 is a way for us, instead of taking our buyer representation agreement and showing it to the listing broker before we show the home, proving that we're not a sub-agent, which is beautiful. We are going to just show the representation disclosure, which proves that we have a representation agreement with our client. This form was created back in 2003. It's been around for a really, really long time, and I've always liked it because how do you prove you're not a sub-agent? Before this rule even came into effect, how do you prove you're not a sub-agent? You'd have to say, I have a representation agreement. How do you prove that to, if you're the buyer broker, how do you prove to the listing agent that you have a representation agreement? Maybe you don't want to share your representation agreement with the listing broker. The client can sign this stating that they are represented by this party. So it's a representation disclosure. This will be a key element in facilitating these new changes. And the third form is registration agreement between brokers, which is an offer of compensation. We're going to need all three of these. When we are the listing agent, we are going to fill out this document. We're going to take the cooperating broker fee, and we are going to fill out that. We are going to countersign it as a broker. We're going to upload that into the MLS for as long as they will allow us. And I suspect that will be something that will be continued. The registration agreement between brokers has to match our listing agreement. So if our listing agreement is 7% and we're sharing 3.5% to the buyer agent, we will fill out the registration agreement between brokers showing that we're offering 3.5%. And we will upload that into the MLS attachments along with well, as a listing agent, that's all we'll do. But when we are the buyer agent, we will first get the buyer representation agreement signed, and then the representation agreement signed, and the representation disclosure signed, and we will be providing a copy of that to the listing agent before we show the property. CTX MLS spoke yesterday. We're already in conversations with Showing Time to be able to upload this representation disclosure to Showing Time as part of your scheduling of showings to make this easier. So key takeaways, there are 4. Buyer representation agreements are required, as they always have been. The difference now is that it will be a federal crime not to use one if you are a member of the National Association of Realtors. No mention of offer of compensation can be listed in the MLS. It has to happen elsewhere. Your Realty Texas website. We are in development right now to be able to upload these 3 documents for the listing agent, upload the offer of compensation, and to disclose the cooperative compensation on our website. It will be a requirement that all Realty Texas agents take your listing page, which could be on your subdomain, kim-dale.123mainstreet.realtytexas.com, for instance, and take that URL and put it into the website of the MLS. And you can put comments in the agent-to-agent remarks stating that for information regarding cooperative compensation, click the website in the MLS listing. It will take you to our website where we'll disclose what that cooperating compensation will be that was agreed to by our seller. And then, of course, a completed offer of compensation and representation disclosure will be uploaded to each one of our Realty Texas websites. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope that a lot of your questions were answered. I hope a lot of the sky is falling situations that you've been hearing has been put to bed. And now let's open it to questions.
Hey, Jack. So there was 2 kind of questions that recycled in the chat. And it was specifically having the buyer's rep sign and hosting an open house, which I know you've gone over through Mega about the 1-pager in the open house, but if you could, it has asked 2 different ways.
So when we host an open house, who do we represent?
The seller.
That's right. Do we have an agreement to represent the seller when we're hosting an open house?
Yes.
The answer is yes, we do. So we do not need a buyer representation agreement. In fact, it would be probably a lack of fiduciary duty for every buyer to come in to say, before I can talk to you about this home, you have to sign a buyer representation agreement. First, in Mega, as we talk about in Mega, our communication really is not going to change our behavior in the open house. Someone is going to walk in, thank you, come on in, take a look around, let me know if you have any questions. What do you think? What are you looking for? You know, the open house script that you've all learned from me through Mega. And once you've determined that this particular client is no longer interested, we put them in a client gateway. They start favoriting listings. You meet them at the front door of the property with your one-page buyer representation agreement. They put the initial and you walk in the door. Literally exactly what I have been teaching for the last 10 years is all you have to do. Victoria, I see your hand up.
Okay, I'm trying to make sure I word this correctly, but okay, so we represent you, Realty Texas, when we're doing a listing agreement. And the way I word it is our office charges 6%, 3 for the listing side and 3 for the buyer side. So my question though is we are saying now too that 3% is negotiable for the buyer. We can pay them as little as 0. How do we, I guess the word is advise the seller correctly, I guess, on the ramifications possibly of putting 0 compensation for the buyer agent? I hope
You're
I
gonna-
worded it right.
I appreciate the question, and I think it's a valuable question to have answered. The question is that every time you limit your buyer pool, you limit the ability to sell your home for as much as you can. When you take away cooperating broker compensation, you limit your buyer pool, which means you have fewer buyers able to participate in purchasing that home, which means you lower its value. And so by offering cooperative compensation, it lowers the bar for entry for home ownership, and it makes their home more marketable to a larger group of people, therefore making it sell for more. And by
Perfect.
the way, this is all being recorded.
Perfect. Thank you for, I had one, let me just make sure you answered all my questions. Okay. So my other question is they kept saying over and over that we can't put the compensation in the MLS. And I know you're saying we're going to be putting that, I wrote it down. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I get this correct. What we're going to offer for compensation in a document uploaded, right? Okay.
Yep.
I just want to make sure I understand that that's okay. And then lastly, is there going to be any, because there's only 84 of us on here. I think you have 300 something people. So I think there's going to be some people that still may not know how to eloquently speak to this. Are you going to have some sort of document that we have the listing side sign and the buyer side sign that says that, for example, and I'm just saying this, I have no problem asking my buyers for a representative agreement, but that it is now a federal offense that we can't show them a house without it. Like, is there going to be something we can say, hey, this, to make it a little easier for those that have a challenge too, that we can't do that?
Yeah, so that document has been around since 1992, and it's called your information about brokerage services. Your information about brokerage services says, Mr. Buyer, I can aid you in a transaction, but I don't represent you. Now that document is going to be changed because your information about brokerage services from TREC is going to say that sub-agency, I can't aid you in a transaction without a representation agreement signed, because the information about brokerage services says I can help you, but I don't represent you. I actually represent the seller. And so, yes, we're going to see an updated information about brokerage services because that sub-agency is no longer going to be a thing. Now, remember, this is where things are going to get very confusing because not all real estate agents are realtors. And these rules apply to realtors only. And TREC doesn't care if you are a realtor member or not. You are licensed by TREC. And so TREC is going to have to get involved here because of the changes in the realtor organization and the requirement for realtor members, not real estate agents, but realtor members. So N.A.R. is helping Texas Realtors and all your local MLSs come up with the paperwork that initially will be brought to us by July. I can't speak to what that's going to look like because no one knows because the documents haven't been created, but there will be tons of paperwork and talking points. Yes. But the 3 pieces of paper that I went over, which is your agreement between brokers, your representation disclosure, and your buyer representation agreement, is all you guys need right now. And remember that the person who pays the commission is the buyer. The buyer pays the commission. All we are agreeing to is on the closing disclosure, reimburse the buyer for the commission that they paid through our compensation. But the commission is paid to the listing broker. The listing broker is paid a commission from the seller. And we've told the seller in our agreement that, hey, we're going to give some of our commission that you're paying us to the cooperating broker. So the seller's not paying the buyer's commission. The
Really?
seller is paying Realty Texas, and
Right.
Realty Texas is paying and covering the buyer side commission. So it's very important, which is why these lawsuits had no merit in the first place, because they're pointing the finger to the wrong person. But by using the correct documents, which we've always used, is not going to be a change in business. So do I think your conversations at your listing agreements are going to change? Probably not. I've only had 2 people out of the gazillions of people that I know talk to me about this. You've all probably had less than 5 people talk to you about all of this that's going on. We have signed agreements in the last week and no one has asked us about this. Agents are terrified about negotiating buyer side commission, but then once they pull out a buyer rep agreement, people sign it and they're like, oh, it's not nearly as terrifying as I thought. So you're going to see a lot less heartburn. But I think what's good about all of this is that the use of a representation agreement for a buyer is going to become as normal as the use of a listing agreement for a seller. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for everyone. Thank you, Victoria, for your questions. I appreciate them. Next up is Daniel. And Victoria, if you have any more, let me know. Daniel Gooden, William Diaz, and then Maria.
Hey, Jack. Couple things. One, we weren't, or at least I was taught that we weren't really allowed to negotiate the buyer agent commission based on what was put into the MLS, right? So if it was said 3% in the MLS, we weren't allowed to negotiate that. If it was 2.5%, we weren't really allowed to negotiate that. Is that going to change now that it's not going to be in the MLS per se?
So I think what you're alluding to is if you represent a buyer client and you have a representation agreement, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have a representation agreement with a buyer for, let's say, 3%, and you arrive to a property that is offering 2.5%, can you go to the listing agent and say, my rep is 3%, you're offering 2.5%, will you pay me 3%? Is that the question you're asking?
Yes.
That has never been prohibited. So this is the thing. Prior to the submission of an offer, you can negotiate commissions all day long. But once you submit an offer, you can at that point no longer commingle the negotiations of the offer and commissions in one conversation.
Wow,
So
that was
if,
totally misrepresented to me how that worked.
yep,
So,
there's
okay.
been a lot of confusion over the years on that, but the code of ethics very clearly states that I can pick up the phone and I can call a listing broker and I can say, hey, my agreement is this, you're paying this. Are you guys willing to pay more? Now, what is a violation is for me to call my client and say, hey, they're paying less. We're not going to see it. Or me just choosing not to show that property to the client in the first place. It's steering regarding commissions. And that would be a federal crime and always has been, always will be. And so we can't choose properties based on commissions, but we can always call the listing agent and say, I have an agreement with my client for this. You're paying this. Are you guys willing to pay more? And that is between brokerages to determine of whether or not they want to pay more or not. So yeah, that's not going to change.
Okay. And the other part of that question is, so if I'm going to take a listing and somebody's not wanting to do our 6%, which is what I've been told that's what we're supposed to ask or request because we don't want to be a discount brokerage, correct? So does that need to come to you at that point, or if they're negotiating for less than 6, does that call need to come to you? How does that work?
Yeah, this whole entire scenario has nothing really to do with listings and has nothing to do with sellers. And so the conversations that you've had with sellers for the last 20 years is going to be the same conversation you're going to have with the next 20 years. And so again, really, this has nothing to do with your negotiation at the table of a listing. It's the same, nothing changes. Literally nothing changes. The only thing that changes is where you're going to put the number once you have it on your listing agreement. So that doesn't change. So the same talking points that we've had forever about negotiating your seller commission is the same. Do I think you're going to have more sellers previously trying to negotiate commissions? I really don't. Americans are horrible negotiators. They don't want to negotiate. And most of the clients that I work with, you do 6, 7, 8, and they circle 7. So I think agents are terrified regarding about the whole commission conversation because they also don't like to negotiate, and sometimes they take it very personally, like you don't want to pay my value and that kind of thing. If someone does bring commissions, one of the things I found interesting in the Master Certified Negotiation course is that the ultra wealthy, they know that they need 3 things in life to be successful. They need a good CPA, they need a good attorney, and they need a good real estate agent. And one of the questions that they ask agents, are you willing to discount your commission? Because they know if you're willing to throw them under the bus, if they're willing to throw themselves and their family under the bus, they're apt to throw the client under the bus 10 times more. And so your ultra wealthy are going to ask you a question, are you willing to discount your commission? And if you say yes, they will never hire you. And so I think we all just need to go back and revisit our negotiation, our value, like Kevin Sears said, who is our interim our chairman for our National Association of Realtors. We need to go back to just what we've always done. We are salespeople. Salespeople sell a service. We need to understand our value and be able to articulate that value. And more importantly, talk about our fee and not be afraid to talk about that fee and not be diametrically opposed or offended when someone talks to us about commission and say, yeah, this is the fee. And it's a good thing because this fee is going to help you sell your home. This fee is a mechanism to help you sell your home for more. So I appreciate these questions. Thank you, Daniel. Did you have any other before we move on to William?
No, sir, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, well, if you have any more, please bring it to me. All right, William Diaz, you're up. Batter up. Then Kim Dale will be next. Murray and then
Hey,
Kim.
Jack. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, William. Thank you.
Jack.
Yes, William, I can hear you perfectly.
So my question is, how do you think the builder from a builder's perspective, how do you think they are going to handle this commissions now?
Well, I think builders are going to continue doing exactly what they have always done. When they need to sell a home, they offer compensation to an agent. Builders are not members of the National Association of Realtors. They never have been. The MLSs have always tried to figure out how we can put them into the model because they have a lot of inventory in an inventory constricted country like the United States. We need that inventory to be able to offer it to buyers. It's difficult putting homes that are not built in the MLS anyway, so it's always been a square peg in a round hole kind of a scenario. There's always been an issue with offers of compensation in the MLS as it related to builders anyway, because the listing agent for the builder didn't, well, let's just say the agent that put the listing in the MLS for the builder wasn't being paid a commission. Oftentimes they were being paid nothing. They would put it in the MLS for the builder simply for the leads. And so if a commission dispute came up, the listing agent, there's a rule that says an arbitration mediation cannot be greater than the initial payout of the commission. So if an agent put a property in the MLS and said, you know, the compensation is going to be $20,000 and someone got paid $5,000, and the listing agent who put it in was actually receiving $50 or nothing, there is no award. So we've always said that in a builder deal, the commission is not an offer of compensation in the MLS, but the commission has to be part of the contract between buyer and seller, and that you negotiate your commission based on that agreement. Now, do I think that the builder are going to stop putting inventory in the MLS? No, I think that they're probably going to be using services like Builder Update and those other third parties, but it's going to be up to that broker who's putting that listing in the MLS to negotiate with that builder to get hired, to show that builder how they're going to be able to satisfactorily advertise that builder compensation to the world. And there's going to be fewer agents out there that have that ability because they're not tech people. They don't have sophisticated websites that can be advertising for the builder. So I think what you're going to have is a value proposition for the average realtor to put inventory in MLS diminish, and those real estate brokerages who have the ability to properly advertise the listing and syndicate it and have that displayed on their website and share the commission amount outside the MLS is going to level the playing field for a new world of advertising builders. So I don't think there's going to be a change there because builders spend a lot of money in R&D to sell homes. When they want to sell a home, do they reduce the price or do they triple the commission? First, they raise the commission. That has been the #1 successful tool in selling a home of all time. I think, William, your question is my favorite out of the bunch so far because, you know, it underscores the builders. The builders know if they need to sell a home, they increase the commission because they understand that it is a tool that helps the home sell because you have more agents trying to figure out how to sell that property. So it's just a beautiful thing. Thank you for your question, William. If you have any more, let me know. Marie, I see your hand up, then Kim.
Also, just so you know, because I don't think you could hear me before, is we do have people with their hands up in the classroom, but you can't see them. So
We'll
they've been waiting patiently.
Okay, you're right. All I can see is the top of your head.
Right, I put my hand up on my, I don't know if
All
you
right.
can see that
So
for them.
we're gonna go with Maria, then Kim, and then we'll go with someone in the classroom. I can actually see Mary Beth pretty well, but that's the only person I can see in the classroom. So thank you for letting me
Yes.
know. I apologize. All right, so Maria, Kim, and then Lisa will pick the first person from classroom. Maria, what was your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry if it's loud. So you said that we would need 3 forms to make sure that we don't have any issues. One is the ABS and the representation agreement. What would be that third form? And if it isn't already on the .me, one of the required forms, will it be put on there for us to be a required form to submit the room?
100% yes. The forms that we're talking about that is going to facilitate the need are the forms that we have been using since our inception back in 2017. The first form is the buyer representation agreement. You have two options there. You have the Texas Realtors 7-page buyer rep agreement, or you have the Realty Texas 1-page buyer rep agreement. On either case, one of the 3 documents is a buyer representation agreement. The second document is representation disclosure so that you can provide proof to the listing agent that you represent that client. And the third one is a registration agreement. Registration agreement between brokers, which is what our offer of compensation is going to be to the cooperating broker. So the agreement between brokers, that form has been around forever. That is going to be our disclosure to the world of what we're offering a buyer agent compensation, which we used to use the MLS for that, but now we have a 2-page form that Texas Realtors has always had for things like for sale by owners or properties that were being sold off market. And so really, if you just think about how we conduct business on properties that are sold off market, first thing you think is, oh, the property's not in the MLS. I need that broker representation, or I need that agreement between brokers form, right? So basically all homes are going to be sold off MLS. Now we can put in the MLS and advertise it, but that's how it's going to be. So it's those types of forms. Again, #1, representation agreement with the buyer. #2, a representation disclosure so that you can provide satisfactory evidence that you represent this client without having to furnish your representation agreement disclosing to the other side what you're being paid. Doesn't matter, but some people don't want to share that. So the representation disclosure just says, I represent this person. It doesn't give any details. And then the third one is broker to broker registration form, which is the agreement between brokers. Good question. Those are the 3. Kim Deal.
Hi. Okay. So one of the issues that keeps crossing my mind is obviously whenever we negotiate with our seller, what our commission is, 5, 6, 7, 8%, whatever it is. And we state, you know, we're going to offer the buyer's agent a certain percentage, right? But all money comes through the broker. So technically the seller is paying us and then we're paying the buyer's agent.
Not technically, wholly
Paying the buyer's agent. But the problem I see here is that when it gets down to closing and you have a settlement statement, it literally says buyer's agent compensation on that settlement statement. It's not going directly to you, the broker, and we aren't
It is.
directly paying.
It is.
The title company is paying.
So we have issued a disbursement authorization DA to the title company showing how our money will be shared. So so our listing agreement is our contract with the client, and then the seller's proceeds we are authorizing the title company to pay. So I understand we can get caught up on the title side paperwork, but that doesn't change because compensation is not being stricken. There is no rule stating that
Right.
compensation is not allowed. Compensation is allowed. We just can't put that number in.
I know we have the DA. I was just figuring that because on the settlement statement, it says listing agent compensation, buyer's agent compensation, both coming out of the seller side, and they're not all one. I just am unsure if that would confuse people.
Yeah, so and that's not changing. So part of the settlement agreement says that compensation continues. There will still be an offer of compensation allowed between listing broker and buyer agency. So that doesn't change. Commissions don't change. Nothing changes. The only thing that changes is that the amount of compensation that is being offered has to be placed out elsewhere than the MLS. That's the only thing that changes. Except that we have to have a buyer representation agreement before we show a home.
Well,
In terms of the compensation portion of it, nothing changes. The HUDs doesn't change. The Alta statement doesn't change. The listing agreement doesn't change except for referencing the MLS. Nothing changes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good questions. All right, Lisa, who is our first in-person question?
That would be Jane Decker.
Jane.
Hi. What I was wondering is if you're a buyer's rep and you're showing 5 homes that day, you have to get 5 forms signed, send them to all the individual listing agents before you show those 5 homes?
One form, and you have to send that one form 5 times.
Oh, I thought it had the address of where you were showing, what you were
Not at all.
showing. So it's, okay, I couldn't see it close enough I thought it was by specific address, but it's a general form that you get signed once, just like the buyer's rep agreement.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So the representation disclosure, you've got to and from has nothing to, so yeah, so when you're doing your buyer representation agreement and you sit down and meet with your client, you go through the rep, you get the buyer rep agreement signed, the representation disclosure signed. And by the way, the representation disclosure has been a required document here for a really long time. And we just recently made it optional, and of course, it's only been unoptional for a couple of months. We're clicking the box to make it required again, because it's good to have. I've always used that representation disclosure as far back as it was created, because I wanted to prove that I wasn't in a sub-agency scenario, so that when I get to the closing table, I didn't have the listing broker offer to pay me whatever they were offering a sub-agent broker. So yeah, great questions, Jane. Thank you. Let's take one more from the classroom. I see Kim, your hand is up again. I don't know if it was from before. Mama's iPhone with no photo, with no screen, so I don't know what's behind that. Daniel Cake, and then I see Victoria as well. Kim, did you have a follow-up question?
No, it's just still up.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, so we have
just one more. Okay, Victoria, did you have your hand up again, or was it from before?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, I think
hold on. I just want to know, because I want to know the order. All right, so I know the order. Mary Beth, you're up first.
Okay, so, got this question from someone else, and I know you tried to address it, but I don't feel like I've gotten a complete understanding of the question about the 3%. Because yes, we signed a buyer rep agreement and, they're gonna pay us the 3%. But let's say we got a buyer that cannot pay it, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they don't qualify, that if they're doing an FHA loan or whatever the circumstances, you can't get enough seller concessions that will help make up that difference. So if for some reason they're offering less, obviously you want us to take the full 3%. That's what we're supposed to bring to the table for you to pay us then our split. How does it work if they can't pay it? Then are we supposed to walk away from that buyer?
So it is a seller now. Offer of compensation has always been a thing. Offer of compensation has always been a thing because it opens up the ability for buyers to have access to a greater number of properties that they can afford, especially those buyers who can't afford it. Sellers are shooting themselves in the foot by not offering buyer compensation. They are shooting themselves in the foot yesterday and tomorrow. Regardless of the change that was made, it's still hurting buyers' ability to purchase a home, especially first-time home buyers that don't have cash. If a seller does not offer compensation to a buyer, buyers are not going to, there's a large percentage of buyers that will not be able to buy that property, period. That is the reality. We have a conversation with them at the table, and it is going to be more important than ever than the listing agents continue doing what we've always done. We've had the same conversation a million times. What happens if my buyer is a VA and they don't have money for a commission? What do we do? This conversation is not changing. And it's the same thing. Sellers outside the VA world, and I know that I read an article yesterday on the National Association of Realtors N.A.R. Director Hub, the hub channel for N.A.R. directors. It's called the N.A.R. Hub, but the directors have a channel. And there were I'm not sure what that committee is called, but it's the committee that addresses financing. It's probably the HUD and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They had an article that they posted that serious conversations are being held right now about the financing of commissions. And although no agreement has been made, there's a lot of push for this. They're concerned regarding appraisals. And so that's what they're trying to figure out, if they're going to have to change the 96.5% rule in order to facilitate compensation. Attorneys get paid. Everyone gets paid. Compensation is necessary for a thriving society. Real estate agents are not expected to be exempted from the capitalist society of the United States of America, who, as we go and we work all day, leave our families at home to go and make a living for ourselves. You deserve compensation. You're taking all the risk by helping someone and maybe getting paid later or not. This is why it was so important for all time for us to be having compensation related conversations with our buyer clients. Does it mean that builders may now have the strongest competitive advantage of all time because they are not going to move away from their compensation that they've done for all time? And some home sellers are really going to find themselves in a situation where they really limit their buyer pool? Maybe, but that also hasn't changed. And so these conversations are going to have to be made in your buyer representation agreements, because you can't even show a home without a buyer representation agreement. And you have already had a conversation regarding compensation. And so we're gonna be having substantial conversations regarding our buyer and their ability. And when the buyer comes to us and says, I can't pay a commission, this is all I have, great. Let's go and look at down payment assistance programs. I have clients right now who don't have money for a down payment. Does that mean that I can take them into Circle C and sell them a home? No. Now I'm looking at the down payment assistance programs and finding areas like Elgin and other areas that have down payment assistance programs that are available for that particular property. We're seeing that. Do we think that the Sitzer Burnett case is good for buyers? Again, everyone is saying that nothing changes. We don't see anything changing. It's just where the commission is being put, where the commission is getting put in the MLS. So we can talk about the age-old question about what happens if the buyer can't pay the commission. But that's an age-old question. That's not a new question. It's the same question that's persisted for the last 100 years. And these changes have nothing to do with the age-old question. I think we're not going to see what a lot of people think. You know, I know, Mary Beth, you've been doing this since before 2015. But I can only imagine the fear that we all had, if you remember, when we moved away from the HUD settlement statement and we moved into TRID. My God, the whole world is going to come to end. There's going to be a 3-day waiting period. And all of a sudden, all closings were going to get pushed out a week, and it's going to take longer to sell a home. And they're telling people, yeah, you need to do 60-day closings now. Nothing changed. So I think there's a lot of fear going on here. But the reality is, before the MLS existed, offer of compensation was an agreement between brokers. The MLS started facilitating that need. It's being moved out of the MLS. So the only thing that's changing is that we were forced to use an MLS, and the offer of compensation has to be put somewhere else. And that's going to be on our website.
Okay, because this morning I was in a listing appointment, which was why I was late for the meeting, because this is all he wanted to talk about. And I had an answer for every single question he had. So, I mean, I was quite proud of myself, because I said everything you've already said this morning, so I appreciate you reconfirming. And I think Debbie had too on Saturday, and that's what they wanted to talk about. So maybe you haven't seen it as much, but I think it's gonna be out there. It is a conversation people are having, but you're right. We as realtors need to be prepared to answer those questions, be able to say. But one of my comebacks to the seller this morning was, so did you pay your buyer's agent commission when you bought this house in 2015? And he said, no. I said, but now you want that to happen on the other end? And he started laughing. He said, well, you got some good answers. And I said, well, I told you I'm experienced. I'm not a discount broker. So that's
Well,
pretty
and
much.
thank you, Mary Beth. That's exactly our job, is to understand our profession, understand the real, what commissions are really for. But more importantly, I mean, I think I've taken 6 listings in the last 2 months, 5 listings in the last 2 months, and I haven't had yet a seller ask me about this. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but you are going to get met with these questions. It's not that this question is never going to come up, but I'm hoping that the talking points today, that the big takeaway is that, well, I know that there's a lot of scary news out there and it's talking about a lot of changes, but the reality, the change is that cooperating broker compensation hasn't changed. It is exactly the same way as before. Just the National Association of Realtors can no longer be a party of disclosure of what commission is, and they have to opt out of it, and it has to be between brokers. Good questions. I see a lot of hands online too still. I'm gonna take it to Myrna May, and then Daniel Cake, and then Ariel. Myrna, you're up. I know you called yesterday about this, so.
Oh, I just want, my question is actually different. I just want to confirm that this applies to leases and to commercial.
Yeah, so the offer of compensation is between brokers for any tenant or purchaser. So commercial listings often have always been off MLS, and we have an LOI. And in the letter of intent, often we address the compensation. And so, in fact, I heard someone say yesterday that the compensation is going to be a lot like we commercial agents do it today. And commercial agents, they pay a lot of commissions, don't they? I think we've had a couple of transactions that were commission payouts in the hundreds of thousands of dollars this year from commercial transactions. And so I think the commercial transaction is a good litmus test of what's going to happen with how brokers are going to behave in this cooperative broker compensation without the MLS helping facilitate that. So yes, you're right in that it doesn't change. We're going to still be getting our buyer tenant representation agreement signed for our buyer or our tenant, and we're going to be having conversations about compensation, and you're not going to be able to show a tenant a property without a representation disclosure unless you are the listing agent and someone wants to see it. And again, in that scenario, you represent your seller and nothing has changed. So really nothing changes there. Exactly right. Thank you for the question. Daniel Cake, you're up.
All righty. So I think my thing I'm curious about with showing that we do have a buyer rep in place, showing a property up front is, I know we're talking about being upfront with the broker to broker, commissions and all that and being proactive, but a lot of people aren't. And so will we be putting our buyers at a disadvantage with, people assuming, hey, well, their buyer's already going to pay them. So I'm not, or, try to not pay the seller. But if a seller has signed that they would pay, does a certain form take precedent? Is it just, it's up for, negotiations? And then if we request, if they haven't provided us with what their seller's willing to pay and we request that form, are they required to show it to us?
Yeah, so now you're talking about legal questions, really legal questions, because you're talking about the exercise of a defaulted agreement. We have a listing agreement that says how much the seller has been disclosed, how much of the commission that we are, as a brokerage, are being collecting, and how much of our commission we are giving to the other side. The seller's not paying the buyer commission. The seller is paying our commission. We're just choosing to give half of our commission to the cooperating broker. And the cooperating broker needs to have approval from the consumer to be paid. Without a buyer rep agreement, a buyer agent doesn't have the authorization to be paid, and they should have never been paid in the first place. And that money should have stayed with the seller because there was no agreement to be paid. TREC rule says a buyer agent cannot receive compensation without an agreement, without in writing from the buyer agreeing to the compensation. And without a representation agreement, there is no such agreement. And it's literally a crime. It's a misdemeanor. Texas rule says if you willfully violate 1101, the Real Estate License Act, that it's a state crime. It's a misdemeanor. And so representing a buyer without an agreement and receiving compensation, that is never supposed to have happened, but it did happen. And so to answer your question, it really comes down to one simple truth. The seller is not paying the buyer's commission. The buyer's paying the commission. So when we sit and have a conversation with the buyer commission, and by the way, this has not changed. It's always been this way. The buyer pays their commission. The seller's just offering, hey, we're going to cover your commission, Mr. Buyer, because we know that that might be a threshold. That might be a barrier for entry of home ownership. So we would like to offer that we cover your commission that you are paying. But never did the seller pay the buyer's agent commission. The buyer paid it. The seller just offered to reimburse the buyer to open up a gateway of home ownership to a larger pool of people. I love your question. Did I answer it? You're on mute again. How do we
And
end?
then we have
Sorry, my main screen went down and minimized. I had to find it. Yes, I guess you did answer it in a way, but also so if we're dealing with other agents at a certain point who aren't
Not
following,
agents, brokers.
or I'm sorry, yes, and they're not providing what they're willing to pay, or I understand the buyer, it comes back around, but
Whether or not they're willing to reimburse the buyer's commission.
yes, how, and we request to see, okay, what did the seller agree? What are they willing to reimburse? And we request to see the form. Are they required to show us what percentage their seller has committed to?
1,000,000%,
I'm
yes.
just wondering if certain listing agents are going to really try to strong arm buyers over this.
Listing brokers.
Listing broker.
It's the firm. It's not the agent. A listing agents don't pay commissions, and listing agents don't receive commissions. And it's important that all you hear this. Agents are not paid commissions. Agents are paid splits. Brokers are paid commissions. It's a state crime for an agent to receive a commission. Agents receive splits, and only brokers enter into an agreement. Agents don't enter in agreements. So it's a broker-to-broker agreement. The listing agreement is in the name of the brokerage. The broker themselves are held personally liable for every agreement they sign, whether it's a representation agreement signed at their brokerage or a listing agreement. And if they misrepresent, lie, cheat, and steal, they can be held liable for fraud. And if a listing broker signs a listing agreement, and that's in the name of the brokerage, and they refuse to honor the agreement they have with the seller, they can lose their license. So if you feel like that sort of thing is going on, our professional standards situation of the N.A.R. is not changing. That avenue is still going to be there. But remember, we are in a marketplace right now. We are in a marketplace where sellers are having to market their property, and properties are staying on the market longer. We're seeing listing brokers increase commissions to cooperating brokers to try to sell homes. And so where we are with the market right now, a seller and a listing agent is foolish to mess with marketing a property by altering the offer of compensation, because that's going to have an X factor that's going to limit the buyer pool. And that's not a decision that an agent gets to make. That is a policy, that a required policy. Brokers are required to have a policy on commission, and a broker is required to have a commission policy in the policies and procedures. A brokerage is not allowed to operate in Texas without a brokerage policy. And part of that policy has to be clear, unambiguous policy to the agents of the firm's commission, of what their standard fee is at that brokerage. Every brokerage has a standard fee. Where the problem is when a agent says that there is a standard fee across brokerages. That's when it turns into an antitrust violation. I love your questions. Thank you, Daniel.
Okay, you answered it. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, cool.
We have another question in the classroom from Ezekiel.
Ezekiel, hello.
My question is this, on this property. And I'm committed to get the seller his asking price. I also run across someone else that wants to buy property, and I sign a representation agreement.
Yes.
Am I even able to show my listing to that buyer, or do I have to refer him to one of our other agents?
You have an obligation to your seller first.
Right.
You have an obligation as the listing agent primarily. So if you have a buyer client that you have a representation agreement and your buyer client wants to show your listing, the same rule persists that was before. Is that we don't have dual agency in Texas. And so the same rule would apply. The options to the buyer is to not be represented or to be represented by someone else. But when you show them the property, you're not showing the property as a way to represent that buyer. You're showing that property through your obligation to your seller. So like I said earlier, there's going to be one of two forms that are going to be signed. Either I represent you or I don't. And we have both of those forms already. We have the unrepresented buyer document that says I don't represent you. And so our IABS and the rules that have persisted for really forever now, since for the topic that we're talking about now, since the 80s when dual agency was stricken from TREC and that was removed from the License Act. If you have a listing, if we have an in-house listing and the actual point person that's assigned to that seller by the broker also is representing a buyer through a representation agreement, then either you're going to refer that buyer out to somebody else in the form and it's intermediary, or that buyer acts as an unrepresented buyer.
Okay, so actually I have to get him to sign the non-representation agreement before I even bother showing him the property.
No. If you're going to show him your listing, you have an obligation to your seller to show the property. Again, we're talking about representation and compensation here. And so if you're going to be paid for your services, you have to have a representation agreement before you show that property. And so again, it just comes down to, if you're going to show a buyer a listing broker's firm, and we're going to take them and show them other properties that are not listed under our Realty Texas umbrella, before you walk into a home with that buyer, you have to have a representation agreement because sub-agency is no longer a thing.
Good. You answered his question.
All right. So Ariel, Merriman, I see your hand up.
Hi, yes. Okay. So just so that I understand, because from what I remember is when we sit down with the buyer rep or a buyer and we are trying to represent them and we give them the buyer representation form.
Yep.
In there, it does show, hey, we are asking for, or we are blank percentage to help to represent you. We're asking 3% example, right? So, hey, my fee to represent you is 3%. We're going to try to get it from the sale of the proceed first, but if not, you're responsible to pay for that, unless it's a VA, right? Then there's other things, right?
No.
So making sure I'm understanding that, right?
Let's make sure I want to really articulate this correctly.
Okay.
Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you will pay this amount. Now, we're going to attempt to have the listing agent cover your fee, but you always pay it and reimburse you. But the buyer pays it and gets reimbursed by the listing broker if the listing broker is offering a reimbursement. But never in the history of real estate has the seller paid the buyer's commission. The
Right, correct,
laws
because it's always
persist.
come from the proceeds, which
No,
the buyer, at the end of the day, the buyer is the one paying the proceeds anyways.
the buyer brings the money to the transaction and pays the commission, and the seller may or may not reimburse the buyer. But the reality is that is how our representation agreements work. I don't care what happens on the closing disclosure because that's not representation. That's just a facilitation of how they're going to put the numbers together, which doesn't constitute an agreement. The agreements that are made are between the buyer broker and the buyer in that agreement and what it says, and the listing agreement and the seller and what it says. And the buyer rep agreement says, you're going to pay this amount. First, we're going to try to get reimbursement from the seller, but if not, this is what you pay.
Right, okay, so I guess that's where my question is how this all came about with this, because if we were everybody should have been doing the buyer rep, and if we were doing that, then there were really no commission questions to begin with because it's stated in the buyer's rep.
Well, Ariel, now you're asking the rhetorical question, which I covered earlier
Yes,
on, is
and I
how,
heard that.
yeah, how in the world is the National Association of Realtors, or really, how did the National Association of Realtors, how were they found guilty of a $1.74 billion payout when it was a baseless claim? The National Association of Realtors says to this day it was baseless. And when you truly understand commissions like you just explained, Ariel, you arrive to the conclusion that there was no antitrust. The buyer always paid their commission. Our listing agreements are poised that way. But look, Ariel, not all states have promulgated listing agreements. Not all states have promulgated buyer rep agreements. Missouri is one of them. Texas Realtors, since the very beginning, has always done us a really good justice here in the state of Texas by having the correct buyer rep agreement and listing agreement. But the reality is, what in the world is a realtor organization doing creating an agreement for a real estate brokerage between them and their client? It's kind of crazy that a real estate agency, a realtor organization, is going to provide a document that I'm going to sign with my client. It's my agreement. It's the brokerage agreement between our client and us. Why is the Realtor Association promulgating that for us? It's good that Texas Realtors did because it created a common promulgated form that we could use if we chose to, but we're not obligated to use the buyer rep agreement they promulgate, but we should have always used one, which is why we promulgated our own. We don't have to use the Texas Realtors promulgated listing agreement, or that's different on Trex promulgated listing agreement. There's never been a promulgated buyer representation agreement, right? So that's always been promulgated by your local realtor organization, not Trek. So I just go back to, why did all of this happen? Not all states are operating the way they should have. Not all brokerages are operating the way they should have. But N.A.R. has been with a bullhorn screaming, this is the way, let me use a Texas term, y'all need to operate. And if you don't operate, bad things are going to happen. And they didn't, and it did. And so now here we are. Now, could have N.A.R. continue to fight this? Yes, but there was over 1,000 lawsuits they would have to win. And no one wins when they have 1,000 lawsuits filed. The question really for me is, what was the organization behind these lawsuits really? Because it wasn't Switzer and it wasn't Burnett. It was not a home seller who had an issue. It had to have been something to the key of CoStar, Zillow, or one of the likes. And CoStar and Zillow are the two that are the most likely culprits. But something was behind this. Yes, they were without merit, 100% without merit. But the National Association of Realtors settled to make all of this go away. And our only effect is cooperating brokerage stays. And the fact that cooperating broker fees stays tells you that it wasn't anti-competitive in the first place. Because if it was anti-competitive, they would have never settled saying, well, the thing that we're suing you for 1.4 billion for, yeah, you can keep doing that. It's not a problem. Makes absolutely no sense. But here we are, the National Association settled, indemnifying all of us, and now we just get to deal with commissions in a different place. 1,000,000%. Thank you, Ariel. Did I answer your question? Do you have any follow-ups before we go on to the next?
No, that was it. I appreciate it. Thank you. Because I was sitting there just confused as to what, and I don't pay attention to other states, and I possibly should, because I guess that's a big deal. I'm like, why? We've already, and I guess it has a lot to do with the brokerage I'm in too, right? Like, not all brokers are making their agents do the buyer rep agreement, where you're like, hey, in the beginning, it was a requirement. Like, this is a requirement for our broker. And I think that's been instilled in me. So it's like, okay, it doesn't make sense.
Well,
So thank you.
Well, thank you for understanding it so well that it didn't make sense, because that meant you understood it.
Yeah,
Cool.
thank you.
Okay, Amanda Wallace, I see your hand up.
Hello. Okay. Thank goodness most of my questions got answered. Okay. So let's see. Let's say we have the seller, which the brokerage says, no, I'm not paying the buyer brokerage commission. Okay. I'm not paying any commission whatsoever. But I'm going to offer concession. That's fine towards closing costs, blah, blah, blah. I'll help the buyer in that way, but I am in no way paying that commission for the buyer.
Sure.
And then we already know, here we are. The reason why we're getting a concession is my buyer can't even afford to, finish buying the home. And so what do we do in that situation?
Well, like I answered Mary Beth's question, which was a very similar question, just asked minutely different. The ability for a seller to offer the buyer to reimburse the buyer for their commission, it lowers the gate for home ownership. It allows more buyers to be able to qualify to purchase for a home. It makes their home marketable to more people. So, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, the reality is that buyer brokerage is important, that buyers like to have a representative. And if you're not willing to reimburse the buyer for the commission, it means that you will have a smaller buyer pool. And when you have a smaller buyer pool, the net effect is your home ultimately will sell for less. When you offer to cover the buyer agent's compensation, which is the number one best concession that you can possibly offer, it opens up your property to be marketable to more buyers. So if you want to exclude some buyers from being able to buy your home, then I guess the best way to do that is to not offer buyer agent compensation reimbursement.
Okay. And if they're just hard-headed and they're just say no, then I guess I gotta
No
make a
difference.
decision.
No difference. No difference if you had that hard-headed seller 3 weeks ago or right now all the way to July. No difference before or after.
Okay.
Yep. People make bad decisions all day long. I got sellers who want to drive their car right off the cliff. Well, I mean, I can tell you it's not going to be good for you, but have at it.
But here you go, right?
That's
Okay.
exactly right.
And then on, now,
But let me just say, serious sellers who need to get their home sold, when is the last time you had a seller that really pushed you hard on a negotiation? I know you've had a scenario, but even then they said they paid your commission. We don't have a lot of these sellers. There's not a lot of them. You're always going to have those people out there that are just impossible to work with. But a serious seller who wants to sell their home, well, they offer the compensation.
Yeah, I've already dealt with one that was 1.5%. I was like, what? They were like, come on, Amanda, and they went on and on. I was like, oh, you've got to be.
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, what is your goal by offering that 1.5 commission? Is your goal to save money? Because the more commission you offer, the higher your net will be.
Oh my goodness. But yeah, okay, thank you for that. And then I guess on our exclusive or Texas listing agreement, I guess number 5 is going to be, what we negotiated. And then
Nothing changes.
I'm sorry.
Nothing changes on your listing agreement. It's going to be exactly the same. Nothing changes.
Okay. Except for the one that has MLS, we'll just we'll not be filling that part out, right?
That's exactly right. It's one sentence that's going to change. But in terms of the negotiations from your seller perspective, nothing changes. The only thing that really changes is when you fill out the MLS, there's one less field to fill out, and you're going to have to fill out a document and upload that document to the attachments.
Okay, got it. All right,
All right.
thank you. Yes, okay.
Thank you, Amanda. All right.
Uh-huh.
I have 4 more hands here, and I know there's more hands in the classroom. So I think that's Rosny. Rosny, is that you? Your window is smaller than everyone else's, and your name is right over your face, so I can't. Yes, it's Rosny. Hello there. All right, so hit the mute button, Rosny. What's your question? I'm going to unmute you, or else I'm going to attempt to because this is not working.
Okay, I'm sorry. I got it now. Hi, I had a scenario this week. So we were in the market to purchase. So I had a seller, a listing that I was interested in, and it was showing 2% for commission. So I contacted the listing agent. He got very offensive, and he told me I need to get with my broker because now the sellers make the commission how much that the buyer's agent is gonna get. So he doesn't make that. So I need to get with my broker and get my broker to educate me about the commission. So I was like, okay, well, thank you for the information, but I already know how it works because my broker has been giving us the education since we start with them. So
Well, you always say, well, my broker sits on the board of directors for the National Association of Realtors, and we're uniquely positioned to understand these things. I'm hoping you called Cindy Bell.
Okay.
Did you?
Yeah. Anyway, no, well, I didn't call because I didn't have any questions because he's the one who got it wrong. Because I know the buyer is gonna pay for it for the commission at the end anyways, where just like you had mentioned. So I have a representation with my buyer, and if the commission is not met, so my buyer would pay for it. So I was like, oh, that's fine. Because I was the buyer. So I was like, okay, I'll just don't show your house. Anyway, so my thing is I have another one that we are under contract right now. So they were offering less, but just like you said, Jack, I end up getting $11,000 funding from my buyer.
So they're net positive.
At the end, they're like end up paying even more.
Exactly right.
So that's why to me, I don't see this as a problem, just like you say, Jack, because you've been teaching me. I don't know about everybody else, but I've been learning a lot about the buyer's rep, that you have to make sure that you don't get no discount, even if you're representing the seller or the buyer. So it's all good. Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy, we all saw that article. We're all in that. When I opened up the class this morning, I said, we are all seeing those articles. We are all seeing the national headlines, and all the national headlines are.
Could you please mute me? Sorry. Could you mute me, please?
All right, there you go, Rosalie. And so, as Wendy posted in the chat, we're seeing all those articles. And like I said, we're inside, and people outside are saying that it's hailing and there's a tornado going through town. We walk outside and the sun is shining and the birds are singing. And so what N.A.R. has done is indemnified all of their agents with no claim of wrongdoing. The only thing that happens is the offer of compensation is moved off MLS and nothing changes. But the soundbite is something different than that. So the National Association of Realtors has to gear up and be better stewards of their responsibility of being our mouthpiece or being our PR firm, telling the world exactly what is going on. And you're going to see more and more of that in the coming weeks. Okay, Lisa, do you have any more hands in the classroom?
Don't think so.
Okay.
No more in the classroom.
So I see Gilbert's hand up. And Victoria, I see Victoria, Amanda, Daniel, and Gilbert. So we're going to go in the reverse order. Gilbert, because you haven't spoken yet.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. I think this just goes, I think I have a contribution, which is just to affirm what Jack says about commissions and what you negotiate with your seller. A seller is always going to be a seller. Typically, most of them, they may be hard, but just an example, I had a seller who negotiated, and we negotiated and ended on 7%. And when the home wasn't selling, he was like, hey, put in 5,000 for realtor's bonus, because he was willing for the house to go. It's all about negotiations too, based on your part. And I think this is what we've been learning a couple of times, like in those classes, where Jack says sometimes don't just settle for don't settle for less. When you go make, you can also go ahead and negotiate. I remember one of my transactions with like a new home construction. I went in and I told them, because they were willing and ready for the house to go, but the standard they had with the builder was 3%. And I told them, hey, I have an active buyer, and if you give me 4%, I'm bringing the buyer tomorrow. They accepted instantly. And the following day, a buyer's rep was signed. We signed our buyer rep already, and we went in and signed in and got the contract executed. So it's all about using those negotiation skills. It worked for me. And the more you do those things, the more traffic you drive into your property.
Yeah, a commission is a valuable tool to help you sell the home and help you help expose the property to a lot wider buyer pool, helps you get a higher net. These things have been proven. And if you want the proof, we always look to the builders to see how the builders are operating when they want to sell a home. They increase the commission. In 2007, 8, 9, when I was doing short sales, we would often offer a larger commission to get the home sold and not reduce the price, and it would be very effective. So yes, thank you, Gilbert. We always have.
I'm sorry, Jack. Go ahead.
I have only 2 more hands, Victoria and Danielle. So let's start.
Go on, and can I just say one thing about Gilbert? Because since we're not going to be able to finish the rest of our business meeting, this was so important. So we're going to send you all that information. But Lauren is going to pop on in the end just to go over something. But I wanted to say about Gilbert, what he just said, he learned from all the training here because he was a brand new agent. And though you won't get it till later, he's at the top of our top 40 list, by the way. He's number 1.
He beat Tim Dale.
Yes, he did. Temporarily beat Tim Dale.
I don't believe it is temporary.
Well, there you go. There you go. So I just want to point that out because you learn these things as brokerage. What Jack's doing right now, there are there are people, we actually have somebody visiting, that's probably going to come aboard, and he's just astounded at what we're doing for our agents. So thank you, Jack. Carry on.
Thank you, Madam Lisa. Victoria, you're up.
Okay, so just a question. The 1417 document that we're going to be sending to the listing agent to say that we have a buyer representation. For the listing agent, are we policing the other agents to send that to us, or are we just going to let them do whatever it is they do?
So as I had mentioned, we are through, as a board of governor with Central Texas MLS, we're already in discussions with Showing Time to require the uploading of the representation or to check off a box certifying that there is a representation disclosure.
Okay.
If an agent lies about that, then they're putting their license at risk. I believe Central Texas, based on the temperature of the room yesterday during our board meeting, that they're going to be requiring upload of satisfactory evidence of a client signed representation agreement. So we're going to be looking to third parties to help us with the facilitation of the proof of representation. I think now we're going to be uploading that into the MLS as an attachment. So that we can show, at least from the side of what we're offering as a compensation, and then on the other side, from the listing side, when the cooperating broker is through Showing Time. So we have all of the technology in place. The only thing that really is being worked out right now is the brokerage is figuring out how they're going to make it clear in compensation. And I really believe that it's going to turn out that we're going to be able to have all of these documents that we need in the MLS attachments. And that's just going to really put all of this to bed. But for now, we're going to be modifying our websites, and that's a good thing anyway. Why would we not want to advertise our in-house listings to the world that we're offering a reimbursement to the buyer agent for compensation? I think that's a good advertisement to make to the consumer, and we're going to have that implemented this week.
Okay, and then the second question is, this is really a lender question, but I just saw some lenders online saying they're probably changing where they help, where the buyer can loop the compensation into their loan. Is that not a realistic? Is there a lender on that?
So the National Association of Realtors has a committee regarding financing and lending in Fannie and Freddie Mac and the HUD underlining guidelines. Currently, it is Currently, there is a prohibition, federal law, prohibiting the financing of a commission for a governmental backed loan. FHA or VA, by the way. Now, VA took it to the extreme and said that the buyer cannot pay a commission, but both of them have that the commission can't be financed. Well, the crazy thing is that the federal government is saying the buyer pays the commission. And for those people who have zero down program, they did pay a commission. It was reimbursed by the buyer, but they paid the commission. How can you say it can't be financed? Because they did finance it. And so I think now that this lawsuit has happened and we've opened up kind of the books and everyone can see how things really work and getting a better understanding of it, that we're going to be seeing legislative changes happening at FHA and VA in the coming months. It's not going to be swift because there's a lot of rhetoric going on at during this election year, and it requires that the House come together and make a resolution. And I mean, they can't even agree that the world is round right now. So getting them to agree to anything is going to be problematic. So I don't know that we're going to have a lot of assistance on that, but we shall see. But I know that nothing's really changing here. Not really. But
Right.
maybe that would be a significant change that we could have used 20 years ago, huh?
Yeah. No, I hope it changes. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Victoria. Daniel, I think you might be the last question of the day.
Okay, so it's more of a statement and kind of looking for some clarifying because I've been very fortunate so far for all listing brokers have always reimbursed me for my buyer commission. So if we have a buyer and the house is 500,000 and our buyer's going to pay us, we're going to make a full priced offer. We attach our buyer rep and we put on the contract 3%. We show our buyers paying that so the seller understands they need, when they're doing a net sheet, they're going to still deduct 3% out, or do we put it somewhere else on the contract, or does it depend on the lender?
No, it actually has to do with us as a firm. So the first thing is that you don't have to show what you're being, what your compensation is going to be from your buyer client to the seller. You just have to show that you're representing that buyer. So the representation disclosure form is a one-pager. I'm going to share my screen and show you guys what that looks like. It actually doesn't have any information on it. To, from, concerning, to BD. I'm representing the following, either seller, we're going to click buyer, you're going to type the buyer's name, buyer signs it, TXR 1417. We show that to the other side. It's none of their business what you're getting paid. Now, if they are offering compensation, then they will have shown that it's in their listing agreement. But how we collect the compensation, and I can tell you that Miguel in our accounting department, because we have already put this into place, we send an invoice to the title company for the fee that gets put on the buyer side, which has always been the case. So the actual collecting of the actual fee is something that happens at the brokerage level.
Okay, so like on the contract, we would still write in that spot
0%.
Okay, so they don't need to know, but then the seller,
If you're talking about the commission amount on the contract on the signature page, that is the amount that the listing broker is offering to reimburse, not how much you're getting paid. So if they're offering nothing, that would be 0%, and then the buyer brokerage firm sends an invoice to title. It gets put on the closing disclosure. Yes.
okay, and then, well, as a courtesy, do we tell the listing agent, hey, this is our offer, but because the loan, our buyer's getting the loan, and then eventually, right, the commission comes back around to us from that settlement statement. So
If
do we
the
tell them?
if the seller is offering compensation, we are going to have the seller sign this agreement between brokerages, and this now becomes an agreement that they're going to pay us. If they're offering compensation and we're the buyer agent brokerage, we're going to be submitting this along with the offer, asking them to certify that they're paying the fee. If not, then we just simply have already sent them this and we send the invoice to the title company to collect the fee.
Okay.
Yep. So these 3 documents is everything that we're going to need to facilitate these changes, which is the 1-page buyer representation agreement, the representation disclosure, which is the same thing as a buyer rep agreement, but it's just a document that we can prove that we are representing that buyer through an agency relationship without disclosing how much we're being paid. You can send them the buyer rep if you want, but I prefer to send them this because it's if they're not covering the buyer agent's fee, it's none of their business how much we're being paid. And then this one, if they are offering compensation, this is the document that enables us to be paid. 1,000,000%. Well, thank you everyone for your interest in this huge, complicated conversation. I know that there is just so much misinformation that's going on. I know Wendy even mentioned in the chat that, you're saying things from CNN and from ABC and all these news medias that's just simply getting it wrong. I've read to you and I've submitted to you in the chat the actual statement of the settlement agreements. You have this recorded. You can go back to it and visit it this as much as you can. If you guys have any additional questions regarding any of this, please feel free to email our team, email me. We're happy to continue answering questions about this. And again, I will post this so that you can all have access to this video later. So this concludes our commission portion of our monthly business meeting, and I'm going to turn this over to Lauren, who's going to take it from here. Thank you all. I appreciate your time.